We are holding today's meeting in a hybrid format in compliance with the rules and regulations for remote committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 8. We have gathered in this manner a number of times already, but before we begin, let me remind all of a few procedures to hopefully keep these proceedings running smoothly. First, consistent with regulations, the committee will keep microphones muted to limit background noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Committee staff will mute the members only in the event of an inadvertent background occurrence. Second, when members are present in the proceeding via WebEx, they must have their cameras on. If you need to step away from the proceedings, please turn your camera and audio off rather than logging out of the platform. Third, when a question is put before the committee, members who are present on the WebEx platform are reminded to unmute themselves for the voice vote. Finally, in the event of a request for a record vote, we will pause proceedings to allow the clerk to set up. All members who are present remotely should stay on the platform to vote. Please do not come to the hearing room if you are already present remotely. And now let me turn to today's business. In today's meeting, we will consider legislation aimed at addressing a long-standing Social Security problem, as well as 6 resolutions of inquiry. First, we will take up H.R. 82, the Social Security Fairness Act of 2021, which would fully repeal the Social Security Government Pension Offset, the GPO, and the Windfall Elimination Provision, known as the WEP. I am intimately familiar with these issues and provisions, and they cause challenges and problems for many public employees in my constituency and beyond. The bill we are considering today, while very popular, we also acknowledge that there are concerns with the broader impact on the solvency of Social Security. We are faced with very challenging questions: how to address the legitimate concerns of hardworking public servants while also safeguarding Social Security for all, and indeed for generations to come. I remain committed to finding a path forward and will continue working closely with Member Brady to find meaningful relief to those who have spent their lives in service of their communities. Mr. Brady's efforts on this, along with mine, repeatedly have been enthusiastic and supportive of trying to find a real solution. Next, we will address several resolutions of inquiry that the minority has introduced. The committee takes our responsibility to conduct oversight quite seriously, but that's not what these resolutions are about today. In this Congress, we've held numerous hearings with the Biden administration and continue to carry out this essential function of Congress with consistent engagement from the executive branch. Further, it's my understanding that the Biden administration has been quite responsive to requests from this Congress. This stands in stark contrast to the stonewalling that we were met with in the previous administration. Instead of accepting prior responses, even if they have not been what they wanted to hear, these issues are being forced on the committee to waste time and simply further talking points in the campaign season. Let me be clear. These resolutions have no legal force. This is purely an exercise in politics, and it doesn't get to the heart of what is ailing our country. There's nothing here that will help Americans put food on their tables, pay their bills, or take care of these families. For these reasons, I will urge colleagues to vote to report the resolutions adversely when we turn to their consideration. With that, let me recognize Mr. Brady for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Neal. Let me begin with the resolutions of inquiry. President Biden promised on his first day in the White House he would bring transparency, quote, truth back to the government. But with his promises to unite America, defeat COVID, and make our neighborhoods safe, he failed on this promise too. From the greatest theft of American tax dollars in history, to the sudden destruction of 30 million tax returns, to the giveaway of life-saving American vaccine patents to China, to a rash proposal to give up Congress's sovereignty of America's tax code to foreign organizations, to an illegal effort to ignore the Obamacare letter of the law, to sending stimulus checks to felons and the dead, the Biden administration has pursued unprecedented executive overreach to impose radical White House policies that are hurting the American people and driving inflation even higher. During his first year, the president's issued more executive orders and approved more major regulatory burdens than any recent precedent. Many of them have been rejected by federal courts. Those actions have been costly for the American people. Because the public deserves to know how these radical actions occurred, congressional Republicans have repeatedly sought information from the administration about the expected and the actual impacts of these policies. Administration, of course, ignores Congress's oversight responsibilities. I was pleased when Ways and Means Oversight Chairman Pasquarello agreed the IRS should never ignore a request by any member of this committee. I think we all feel that way about how the agencies in our jurisdictions. Ways and Means Republicans will use every tool available. We invite our Democrat colleagues to join us in exercising the committee's robust oversight and investigative powers now and in the future, because the American people struggling in President Biden's cruel economy deserve to know how their government works. Also under discussion today, as the chairman noted, is an issue that I care deeply about and many of us have spent years working on, making sure our teachers, police, and firefighters are treated fairly in Social Security by providing relief for workers and retirees who are harmed by the windfall elimination provision, or WEP. WEP's a one-size-fits-all policy from 1983 that reduces Social Security benefits for public servants who spent a portion of their career contributing to a Social Security substitute, but they've also paid Social Security taxes in a second job, or a first career, or even a last career. Each month that we wait to address the WEP, millions of public servants are losing benefits they worked hard to attain. They deserve equal treatment in Social Security, just as other workers are treated. But how Congress provides relief from WEP and the government pension offset is crucial. First, the solution should seek equal treatment for public servants in a Social Security substitute without creating worse treatment for the 96% of American workers who only paid into Social Security. We don't want to flip the unequal treatment, punishing the vast majority of workers and retirees in Social Security through their benefits or their spouse's benefits. Secondly, any solution should protect the solvency of Social Security for the long term. Social Security is already in deep financial trouble, running a nearly $2.2 trillion deficit over the next 10 years. Congress doesn't act, these Social Security benefits will be cut by a stunning 24% in 2034, barely a dozen years from now. So Congress shouldn't take any action that accelerates the insolvency of Social Security over its 75-year window. Finally, the solution shouldn't impose or require higher payroll taxes, either on workers or Main Street businesses already struggling with record high inflation. Later during this debate, I plan to offer the Bipartisan Equal Treatment of Public Servants Act 2021. The bill includes a solution that not only improves Social Security's finances, but also permanently replaces the unfair WEP with a new, more equitable formula that takes an important step to put public servants on equal footing with other American workers. This bill will replace the WEP with a fair formula based on each individual's work record, tailored to their work history, not a one-size-fits-all formula. Is this bill perfect yet? Absolutely not. There are some outstanding issues we are working on to make sure it's fair to all while protecting the finances of Social Security. I plan on withdrawing the amendment at the appropriate time so Chairman Neal and I and this committee can continue to work to find consensus to repeal and replace WEP, immediately beginning to get public servants more of their hard-earned Social Security and do it in a way that doesn't accelerate the insolvency of this important program. That, Chairman Neal, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Brady, for what I think is a very accurate description of the immediate business that's in front of us. So the first order of business today is H.R. 82, the Social Security Fairness Act of 2021. This bill aims to address the longstanding problems caused by Social Security's windfall elimination provision, or WEP, and the government pension offset known as GPO. While well-intended, these provisions unfairly penalize many hardworking public servants and their family members. After serving their communities for years, teachers, fire, police officers, and other public employees in certain states are hit with an unwelcome surprise after retiring, a reduction in their Social Security benefits due to WEP and GPO. These provisions negatively affect over 2 million retired public servants across the country, including 100,000 in my home state of Massachusetts. I know how important this is because I hear from workers and retirees with great regularity about the WEP problem and the need for action. I have heard from countless constituents about the shock and dismay when they learn that their reward for serving as a public employee is an unexpected reduction in the Social Security benefit that they were counting on. This is not a new issue for me or for the committee. I've been a long champion with Mr. Brady of fixing the WEP program. His efforts here should be acknowledged in trying to find a solution. He and I have been consistent in our steadfast effort over tens of meetings to try to fix the WEP. The bottom line is clear. Public servants like teachers, municipal workers, and public safety officers should not miss out on the Social Security benefits they earned over decades of hard work. There is a lot of support for addressing this issue. At the same time, as the committee with sole jurisdiction over Social Security, it's our duty to ensure we are safeguarding the fiscal health of Social Security for all its participants. There are concerns about the impact of this bill and what it would have on the Social Security Trust Fund. The Social Security actuary, who has estimated that H.R. 82 would reduce the financial health of Social Security's trust fund, moving up by 1 year the date when the system could not pay full benefits to 2034. This is part of the real challenge, to address the legitimate concerns of hardworking public servants while safeguarding Social Security for all for generations to come. So today, we are responding to the rightful interest in this issue and also following the regular order by considering H.R. 82. I remain committed to addressing this issue, forging a path forward, working hand in hand with Mr. Brady. Our ultimate goal is enacting legislation that provides long overdue relief to these hardworking public servants. Now, let me offer Mr. Brady an opportunity for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with those remarks. I first want to thank the Republican leader of the House Administration Committee, Representative Rodney Davis, for his diligent, authentic work to provide relief to public servants from two 1980-era laws that docked their Social Security because they participated in a Social Security substitute at work and paid into Social Security as well in their second job or second career. Those of us who've worked on the WEP and the GPO issue for years owe him and his colleague a debt of gratitude for raising the profile of these unfair Social Security provisions. Social Security Fairness Act has been around 4 decades in Congress. It's never become law or even close for 2 very valid reasons. First, because it goes beyond equal treatment for public servants who are in a Social Security substitute, and in many cases grants them better treatment than the 96% of workers who participate only in Social Security. That simply flips the unfairness off a few and imposes it on the many. No one wants that. And it's not just the WEP, the same goes for the government pension offset, which affects 2 worker families, is similar to the dual entitlement rule that affects spouses and widowers in Social Security. With repeal of the WEP, of the GPO in this bill, spouses and widowers who paid into Social Security their entire lifetime would continue to have their spouse's benefit reduced by half, while public servants in the substitute would not. This would create smaller benefits for the spouses and widowers of the 96% of families who paid into Social Security their entire lifetime. That too is an equal treatment. It's unfair, and no one wants that. The second major concern is this bill is so expensive. It adds over $800 billion to the unfunded liabilities of Social Security, as well as adding $103 billion more to the over, for this decade, $2.2 trillion in Social Security deficits, just this decade. As a result, Social Security goes bankrupt sooner by a full year, making it even harder for a future Congress and this committee to save Social Security from severe benefit cuts. While I'd argue that these teachers, police officers, and firefighters participating in a substitute have already made these contributions into Social Security without getting their fair share back, given the pending insolvency of Social Security, this is a perilous issue. If we want real relief to become law, we have to marry the good work of authors Davis and Spanberger in our committee's shared goal of Social Security fairness with a better way to provide relief for our police, teachers, and firefighters. This is important. Like others, I've worked nearly 2 decades to find a bipartisan bill that achieves fairness and can become law. And together, I found a remarkable leader in Chair Neal on this issue as well. That's why I introduced the Bipartisan Equal Treatment of Public Servants Act, which includes a solution that not only improves Social Security's finances, but also permanently replaces the unfair WEP with a new, more equitable formula that puts public servants on equal footing with other American workers. Not only would this bill replace the WEP with a fair formula based on each individual's work record, would generate about $100 billion in savings over the next 75 years, which can be used to resolve the differences that Chairman Neal and I are working on. It immediately begins to put Social Security back into the pockets of teachers, police, and firefighters who were treated unfairly in WEP, and ensures everyone is good and better off than they are today through the next 40 years. It is not perfect yet, still needs work, no question. But Chairman Neal is equally diligent on this issue, also has legislation along these same lines. We continue to try to narrow the differences, which are really issues 40 years in the future that will have already been addressed when Congress saves and strengthens Social Security within the decade. But we have to take seriously the long-term finances and impacts of changes in Social Security. We are close, but there are still some pretty important hurdles to resolve. We don't have an agreement yet, and we know the clock is ticking. So we are committed to working together this week, next week, the week after, until we find common ground on a bill that can deliver what authors Davis, Spanberger, and the co-sponsors of the Fairness Act hope to achieve for our public servants. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I think that is our intention here to certainly acknowledge the good work of Mr. Davis and Ms. Stamberger on this issue as well. So the committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 82. Without objection, the measure will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Does anyone wish to strike the last word? We'll go back and forth. Now, Mike. The gentleman from California is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having the hearing. And a special thanks to Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member for their commitment on addressing this issue. I move to strike the last word. There's no question that our country benefits greatly from the valuable and important contributions made by our seniors, and it's critical that we ensure they have our support. Social Security is one of our nation's most successful government programs, which currently provides monthly benefits to almost 70 million people. There are 145,000 Social Security benefactors in my district in California who receive $236 million in benefits each month. And I want to point out that this isn't just money to these folks. This is money that's spent in local communities. If you use the most minimum multiplier effect, these dollars are spent across the 5th Congressional District of California to help everyone. The WEP and the GPO impact hardworking Americans who spent years serving our public. These two provisions are unfair, arbitrary, and undermine the retirement security of many retired public sector employees, their spouses, and their families. Pension offset requirements have had unfair and negative consequences on retirees, including teachers, firefighters, and other state and local government employees, public servants. A disproportionate number of these workers are women, and many of them live in California. This is a long-standing issue, and I believe reform is needed. But we need to make sure we do it the right way. I'm committed to continuing to work with my colleagues to find a solution that addresses this issue and enables public servants in my community and across the country to receive the retirement benefits they not only deserve, but the retirement benefits they worked so hard to obtain. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Does anybody else wish to strike the last word? The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you and our ranking member for bringing this bill up for discussion. It's important. This Social Security, we know, is an important component of how most Americans plan for their retirement. And the concept of fairness has been central to the way we pay into the system and receive benefits from ever since its inception. I wholeheartedly agree that we need to address these longstanding concerns with WEP and GPO. It is just as important to make sure that seniors across America aren't being shortchanged by the benefit calculations as it is to avoid unintentional overpayment. Unfortunately, these aren't new concerns, as have been stated. I am still disappointed we couldn't move a bipartisan solution out of the committee when we had the opportunity to do so back in 2016. However, as written, this bill will actually increase costs by $146 billion over 10 years. And the Social Security Administration Chief Actuary projects it will shorten the solvency window of Social Security by at least a year, with the Social Security unable to pay full benefits to seniors by 2034 or possibly even sooner. These solvency concerns must be addressed in a comprehensive manner. WEP and GPO must be addressed as part of a bipartisan piece of legislation to strengthen and actually save Social Security for future generations, not as a standalone effort on the consensus calendar which could further complicate our ability to plan for Social Security's long-term future. My vote to advance this bill out of committee today is for that purpose, to make sure we have the time and space to draft a comprehensive solution which ensures that our seniors and the generations behind them can continue to expect Social Security to be there as a foundation for their retirement. I appreciate the intention for this vote to help secure a more thoughtful consideration on the issue rather than being forced through on the consensus calendar. However, I can't, in good conscience, vote in support of a motion which supports this out of committee positively, because I believe this should be considered as part of a broader legislation to modernize and sustain Social Security. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. We certainly hope that the purpose of this gathering this morning is to crystallize the issue and so it's more understandable for all that are involved. And with that, let me recognize, is there anybody else who would like to move, strike the last word?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Larson is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, as you often have said, this is the most consequential committee in Congress. The votes that this committee takes are important, and it's recognized throughout both chambers just how important they are. I want to commend, first and foremost, President Biden for coming out early in talking about the need for total repeal of WEP and GPO. As both Mr. Brady and Chairman Neal have indicated, a measure long overdue. I especially want to commend Abigail Spanberger and Rodney Davis for their incredible work to get this message to a point where the most consequential committee in Congress is addressing it. Now, Sam Johnson is someone I revered in this body, both because of his service to the country, but he was also chair of the Social Security Subcommittee. He also had a comprehensive bill that addressed all of Social Security, not just 2.7 million people, but all 65 million people that are on Social Security. I think the work of Rodney Davis and Abigail Spanberger has brought this now to a point where hopefully, as President Kennedy would say, that we can rally hearts to fire center to address the real issue. I have an amendment I'm going to introduce, but I only wish that Rodney Davis, who lost an election, would still remain in Congress to continue to move that initiative forward. And I especially commend Abigail Spanberger in this electoral season where people go after one another for taking a stand in a district not impacted by weapon GPO, but has numerous federal employees throughout the state of Virginia. In a very close election, she had the courage to stand up and vote. Voting is what serving in Congress is all about. Sometimes those votes are difficult and challenging. But Mr. Chairman, I want to commend you and Mr. Brady for your approach. I would also add in my amendment, there's a much broader issue that has to be faced in a nation that's in the midst of a pandemic, in a nation that's going through inflation. And the group that's hit hardest by that are people on fixed income. And that group happens to be the seniors of this great nation. And I hope and can continue to push for a markup of our Social Security 2100 as sacred trust. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Is there anybody else who would like to strike the last word?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to strike the last word,
I'm
please.
going to recognize Mr. Smith to strike the last word, and you should be fully aware the chair has a plan here for recognizing everybody who wishes to speak. They've all been winking at me. Gentleman from Missouri is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and Ranking Member Brady for having this discussion. I also want to thank several of our colleagues. That's not just on this committee. I know Ms. Letlow from Louisiana, Mr. Graves from Louisiana, along with Mr. Davis from Illinois, has been working and advocating for this issue. And it's something that they greatly care about. You know, Social Security, it's a vital lifeline for seniors across the country, providing financial stability for those who have worked hard, they've paid into the system, and earned their retirement. This is true for all Americans, including those affected by WIP and GPO. These workers, our teachers, our firefighters, police officers, they deserve fair and equal treatment for their Social Security benefits. Current law falls short on that promise, and I hope our committee can rectify the wrongdoing moving forward. This legislation being considered today, however, well-intentioned, is not the solution. A full repeal of WEP and GPO trades one injustice or another and jeopardizes the entire Social Security program in the process. At a price of $180 billion over the 10-year budget window, and growing to more than $800 billion over the 75-year projection. Enacting this bill would be like a permanent 0.12% payroll tax increase for all American workers and will accelerate the Social Security Trust Fund insolvency date by 1 year. Preserving Social Security for all beneficiaries is the top concern for me and my constituents. And any legislation that further derails the solvency of the program should be strongly considered with that concern in mind. I look forward to working with my colleagues on this bipartisan issue and finding a solution that fairly addresses the mistreatment of workers affected by WIP and GPO. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Is there any other member who wishes to strike the last word? The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For many years, I've been a sponsor of legislation to end both the windfall elimination provision and the government pension offset. I'd hope that today would finally be an opportunity to see action to correct this injustice. And I hope the process that you have just described and Mr. Brady has referred to will eventually produce some real results this year for the many who have waited so very long. The original purpose of WEP, as signed into law by President Reagan, was not unreasonable. It sought to ensure that those who had significant employment for which no Social Security employer taxes were being paid and who were entitled to some separate government pension would not be treated the same as those who paid into Social Security their entire career. In practice, however, the WEP formula is unfair and has a disproportionate impact on those with the lowest incomes and benefit amounts. It often penalizes teachers, firefighters, and other public service workers upon whom we so very much depend, even when a portion of their employment was outside of Social Security. The WEP can mean a monthly Social Security check is cut by as much as 50%. A faculty member at Austin Community College, for example, who may have extensive prior employment covered by Social Security, ought not to have to take that kind of hit. It is just not right. My very first debate over this provision with Mr. Brady was actually way back in 2004, in opposing legislation that he supported to close what was referred to as the last day rule, by which some Texas teachers would switch to non-teaching jobs at the end of their career to circumvent the WEP. Their self-help was hardly the best way to address the WEP, but it was certainly understandable. Later in 2016, as chairman of this committee, Mr. Brady authored legislation purporting to correct the WEP. And while the objective was worthy, I was concerned that as written, the Brady proposal harmed more people than it helped. And even though Mr. Brady was both the author and the chairman of this committee on the day we were to consider the bill on his own accord, he pulled his proposal down without seeking a vote or debate. As I've told supporters of WEP and GPO repeal who've asked me about that effort and others over many years, the cost of repeal to the Social Security system even though it is a cost that is already really borne by these public servants themselves, is significant. The current estimate is $182 billion. The difficulty of obtaining agreement on how to pay for that cost is made all the greater by the fact that this is a major problem in a few states like Texas, California, and Massachusetts, Illinois, and Ohio, but not in the remainder who have had their public service remain within the Social Security system. To fix the WEP and the GPO is costly. You either pay for it with more revenue, or you impact the solvency of Social Security or reduce the benefits of others who rely on Social Security, as Mr. Brady proposed back in 2016. I maintain that the most practical way to deal with this problem is through broader Social Security reform. That's how we got WEP in the first place. And an opportunity to do that has been advanced by Mr. Larson with his Social Security 2100 proposal. It may not be perfect, but it offers the most comprehensive vision and a reasonable path forward for our consideration, and it should be considered. His bill stands in stark contrast to our Republican colleagues who don't really have a plan to preserve and strengthen Social Security. They do have a number of schemes to break a promise that millions of Americans who paid into Social Security depend upon. Republican Senate campaign chair Rick Scott's notion that Social Security should be vulnerable every 5 years is irresponsible and dangerous. Republican Senator Ron Johnson wants to remove all security from Social Security and put it on a chopping block every year, just like any other government expenditure. And the Republican Study Committee here in the House has made cutting Social Security a core tenet in its proposed budget. Especially in these tough times, we cannot entrust Social Security to those who would only cut more holes in the safety net. We must also continue to vigorously oppose the risky privatization plans that Republicans would have used to divert substantial payroll taxes to Wall Street management fees. I believe that Social Security 2100 is the best path forward to resolve this problem. But at a minimum, I hope that by year end, we see action on the WEP to reduce the inequity that exists, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Is there any other member just to strike the last word? The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is one of about, 7 or 8 items on our agenda today. And the reason that this is on our agenda is the chairman at the beginning of the hearing said that most of these items that are up for hearing today are a political stunt, and that they are no real substance and won't help American families. Actually, most of these deal with things like discovering if there's fraud in the COVID payments that we paid out for unemployment and so forth. And also on trying to figure out why the IRS destroyed 30 million tax returns. I think Americans are very concerned about these things. And I do resent the chairman referring to our motions, my request for information on why the IRS destroyed these tax returns, which are a legitimate thing that the American people are worried about, as a waste of time and a political stunt. But this WEP issue is particularly important. This is so important that 290 members of Congress have signed a motion to bring this to the floor to have a vote on it. 290, 2/3 of the people in Congress want to have a vote on the floor. And the only reason we're having this hearing today is to prevent that vote. That's what we're doing. We're going to prevent the vote that 2/3 of the members of Congress want to have on this WEP provision. My mother was a school teacher. She taught for the federal government on the Air Force Base in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Raised 2 children, single mom, on that school teacher salary. When the base closed as a result of one of the BRACs in 1992, she went to work preparing the early childhood plan for the state of South Carolina. And she really set up certification of daycare workers and so forth in the state. And she retired from that a proud, lifelong public servant. When she got her first Social Security check, she was shocked. She was shocked that the government, she called me, she said, the government is stealing my Social Security. That was, I don't know, 20 years ago. I'd never heard of the WEP before then. I was a tax lawyer. I did some research, and sure enough, well, she died April 13th. And we've been talking about this WEP program the whole time I've been in Congress. And there have been proposal after proposal after proposal to get this resolved. Well, Mom never saw that. She passed April 13th. You say, Mr. Chairman, that you hope this, whatever this is today, it's not a hearing, whatever this is today crystallizes the issue. Well, if you really want to crystallize the issue, we ought to have a hearing on it. This 2-year Congress, which is almost over, we've had 19 hearings. There's plenty of issues that could help American families like this to resolve to make their lives better and help them putting food on the table, but no. The majority should be embarrassed about what they've done this Congress. The only time we have a hearing is when they, at the last minute with no notice, when they want to bring something up and force it through. If we want to crystallize this issue, Mr. Chairman, let's get serious about it. Let's have hearings. Let's bring in people who know what they're talking about. Tell us, educate this committee on the upsides and the downsides, and let's take a vote and get it resolved. And because we've sat on our hands for decades with this, 290 members of Congress have signed a resolution to bring this to a vote on the floor, and we're having this hearing today to prevent that vote. We should be ashamed. I yield back.
The chair normally tries to refrain from commentary on a member's statement, believing that the flow of legislation and the purpose of crystallizing the issue is so stated is to offer a spotlight on the challenge that's in front of us. In the gentleman's comments, he's making it sound as though this was easy to do. What we're suggesting here is that the House will have an opportunity to work its will and to cast a vote. In a point of personal correction here, Mr. Brady and I did have an agreement 4 years ago that was prepared to go to the House floor on a very solemn Friday morning. There were groups that had previously agreed to the solution who then rejected it at the last moment. And Mr. Brady and I were concerned that if the issue were defeated on the House floor that day, that would be the end of the issue. We attempted instead to keep oxygen in the issue, to continue the conversation, and to genuinely find a solution. There is some truth to what everybody says about this issue, and I have treated it precisely in that manner. Is there any other member who would like to strike the last word? I believe that the next person to be recognized is the gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word. As a former educator for over 20 years in the state of California, I'm deeply concerned about the hardship faced by recipients of the windfall elimination provision.
The lady, please unmute.
Oh.
We're having trouble hearing you.
Hello? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word. As a former educator for over 20 years in the state of California, I'm deeply concerned about the hardships faced by recipients of the windfall elimination provision and government pension offset, both of whom are seeing their earned retirement benefits unfairly reduced. The GPO reduces or eliminates Social Security spousal benefits if a worker's spouse has a government pension, and WIP reduces Social Security public service worker benefits by as much as 40 to 60%. That means that millions of hardworking public servants are receiving less for their retirement, even though they've typically worked for lower wages than most private sector workers. And believe me, I've heard from plenty of them from my state of California. In fact, in my own case, I paid for 20 years into the California State Teachers Retirement System, while my husband paid into the Social Security system throughout his life. However, due to the GPO, because of my teacher's pension, I cannot collect on his Social Security should he pass away. And I know many others who've worked and saved their whole lives who face similar situations. What's more, reductions to Social Security benefits hurt state and local government's ability to recruit and retain employees, especially those in mid-career who stand to lose Social Security benefits they've earned. We have to reform these rules for our nation's dedicated teachers, firefighters, and police officers to ensure their much-deserved stability and security in their retirement. I am a co-sponsor of H.R. 82, the Social Security Fairness Act, which would repeal both the WIP and GPO titles to ensure that public servants receive their full earned Social Security benefits. But while the WIP GPO programs are in desperate need of an update, it's also been more than 50 years since Congress has bolstered Social Security benefits. This, in turn, has caused more than 5 million beneficiaries to live below the federal poverty line. And today, the current benefits we do have are at risk. If Congress does not act, we will see major cuts by the year 2034, according to the Social Security actuary. It's imperative that we also act to ensure that the trust fund is adequate to pay out the benefits Americans have earned and deserve. We must work to fix the WIP GPO problem while also ensuring our Social Security system can support future generations of Americans, as is the case in Social Security 2100. We must work forward and ensure that everybody can have a beneficial retirement. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Is there another member who wishes to strike the last word? The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington, is recognized to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, I'm just anxiously waiting to chime in on this, but it's going to be very positive. I believe in you. I have the
I always
utmost.
want to recognize those who are.
Well, I know, and I know you're surprised. Don't act so surprised, but I have the utmost confidence in you. I do, and I know you're sincerely committed to this. And I think at one time you and Ranking Member Brady had a bipartisan solution, and I think you're probably pretty close to coming back to having a unified solution. I've seen unified solutions on this committee work really well. And while there are a lot of legislative solutions to problems, so many create even bigger problems. That is something we all have to be cognizant of. And I think H.R. 82 does that. And I commend the folks that put the effort in to garnering the support. So I think the very fact that the number of co-sponsors on H.R. 82 is so high just shows you how the appetite for solving this problem within the broader Congress. And I know that's easier said than done, but this, for me, represents a very important commitment I made to our retired teachers, among other public servants. But there is rarely a public forum or town hall that I have where the first question from usually a retired teacher on the front row raises their hand and says, please, we worked hard, we served our community, and we just want the benefit that is due us that we paid in to this for. So again, my vote of confidence is in you and Ranking Member Brady to solve it in the right and responsible way. And I thank you for the time. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Arrington, for those good comments. Let me recognize, who else would like to move to strike the last word? The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pasquale, is recognized to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, I think it's a good idea we had this hearing on this legislation today, even though it'll wind up against the wall, it looks like. I think it's very important. I associate myself with most of the ideas that I heard and thoughts from both sides of the aisle. I trust that you and the ranking member will come up with a resolution of this before the end of the year. And I want to, thank Larson for hanging in there. All the work that he's done and the committee has done is not going to be in vain at all, just like I don't think this meeting is in vain today. And for Roger Davis, and Ms. Benanger, I think that they've worked very hard also. Now, I know Larson's bill is paid for, and this bill is not. That's a cause, but I think that Tom Rice hit the nail on the head, in terms of not how this committee operates, but how we've had to accept leadership's dictums about what's more important than other things. I made a commitment in 1996 when I first ran for the Congress that I would never, ever vote to privatize Social Security, that I would always try to protect it, that I always try to make the number in terms of the increase in the cost of living every year mean that there'd be some money for each individual, knowing how many people live on Social Security. How many people live on Social Security? And Tom, the story you told is a personal one. And how can you not listen? You tell me. And things cost things. Sometimes you have to put up the money. Sometimes you have to find a way to do it. So the committee has special responsibilities to protect and expand Social Security. Millions of retired first responders and teachers and other public servants have suffered under the windfall elimination provision and the government pension offset. Repealing these provisions is not something we just started to talk about last month. We've been talking about this for 15 years. And I think we're getting closer and closer to resolution of the two problems I just mentioned. Repealing these provisions would finally allow public service employees to get a fair shake. As the co-chair of Law Enforcement Caucus and Fire Services Caucus, I hear from our first responders every day, that's not an exaggeration, about how important reforming these policies is to them. In New Jersey, more than 23,000 retired and disabled workers and their families are affected by the WEP. And across America, more than 700,000 Social Security beneficiaries are affected by the GPO. It's important to note that repeal of these provisions is included in Chairman Lawson's legislation, which I continue to strongly support, and it is, again, fully paid for. We must not lose sight of the needed benefit expansions Social Security 2100 provides. It's an important bill, and it handled the WEP and GPO problems in, I believe, a responsible way. Today, we have the opportunity to consider H.R. 82, the Social Security Fairness. I know the sponsors worked on it very, very hard. It is a small step towards helping public servants. I don't think it's enough. I don't think it's enough to vote no on 82, even though it's not paid for, because I am positive
this meeting is being recorded.
Put into it by both the major sponsors of this legislation. I support H.R. 82. I think it's a path to a solution before the end of the year. And I look forward to its consideration in our committee today. And no wonder the first responders are confused when I hear that we're against a piece of legislation that's going to help them in this matter, and yet it's not paid for. It has bipartisan support, but it has bipartisan opposition. So they're confused, and we've made them confused. Go back to Congressman Rice's remarks. I want to commend the leadership for getting us here today. I intend to vote for 82. Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Are there other members who wish to move strike the last word? The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Brady. We do have an obligation as members of the Ways and Means Committee to ensure that the Social Security system that our constituents have relied upon, that we're able to keep the promise to them. And we know that even apart from the issue and the discussions today, Social Security is not on a strong financial footing. Currently, the Social Security Trust Fund will become insolvent in 2034. So unless we take steps to save the system, to secure the system, to ensure that we can keep the promise that has been made to the American people, unless we take steps to do that, those that depend on Social Security could have their benefits cut by 20%. Insolvency is not a hypothetical. It's unfortunately imminent, coming up sooner than we may expect. I do believe that there's broad bipartisan agreement that those beneficiaries subject to the windfall elimination provision, or WEP, or government pension offset, GPO, especially policemen, policewomen, firemen and women, and teachers, should not be put at a disadvantage compared to those under traditional Social Security. I also think that most of us agree that those on WEP or GPO probably should not also get an undue advantage over other constituents of Social Security, which is what would happen if we enact a straight repeal without fixing the benefit formula. Unfortunately, this proposal under discussion today puts the solvency of the entire Social Security program more at risk than without it. The bill would cost taxpayers $146 billion over 10 years and increases that solvency gap by $800 billion over 75 years. At a time when Social Security is already too close to insolvency, this bill would only increase that risk, moving up trust fund depletion from 2034 to 2033. Members on this committee have more responsible solutions. For instance, I'm a co-sponsor of Leader Brady's Equal Treatment of Public Servants Act. It's legislation that would repeal the WEP and replace it with a fair formula that ensures that our teachers, firefighters, police officers, postal workers, and more receive their share of Social Security without bankrupting the trust fund. We all know that the legislation we are considering today will not solve the problem. I'm hopeful that my colleagues can instead work together, as many has been saying, on a bipartisan, fiscally responsible solution to provide equal treatment for our nation's public servants while continuing to protect the promise of Social Security for all its beneficiaries. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. Is there any other member who wishes to move to strike the last word? The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I also want to commend my colleague, namesake from Illinois, Rodney Davis, for his outstanding work he and Representative Spangberger have done on this issue. Fixing the WEP GPO issue is critical for Illinois. It affects teachers, letter carriers, postal workers, and state employees. I strongly support fixing the WEP and GPO issues. I look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, to fix WEP and GPO without accelerating the insolvency of the Social Security Trust Fund or harming the 65 million current beneficiaries. I have a large senior presence in my district, and we must protect them at all costs. I strongly support the Social Security 2100 Act that fixes both WEP and GPO, and as well, the Act improves Social Security for 65 million beneficiaries. And I don't know anything that is more important for them and to them than Social Security. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman.
Yield back.
Are there other members who would like to move to strike the last word? The gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, is recognized to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Brady, I thank you for your long work on this, and I'd like to move to strike the last word. You know, the windfall elimination provision impacts some of our nation's best public servants. Our teachers who teach our children, our firefighters and police officers, our first responders, and protect our communities. It's unfairly reduces Social Security benefits for millions of Americans who dedicated their lives to service in their communities. We shouldn't be looking for ways to cut their benefits. We need a solution to the windfall elimination provision. It's a top priority for me and has been since I've been in Congress. It's our job to ensure our public servants receive the benefits they paid into their whole lives. However, almost $150 billion in new spending, opening the door to large overpayments and benefits, and advancing insolvency by eliminating Social Security benefits at a faster rate is not the solution. This is what the Social Security Fairness Act does. Ranking Member Brady has proposed a common sense solution that achieves sustainable solvency, repeals the windfall elimination provision formula, and creates a new formula that would equalize payments for public servants. This legislation would ensure that public servants receive the same treatment as other hardworking Americans, even those who have already retired and felt the negative impact of the WEP. If we keep going down the same path, Social Security is only 11 to 13 years from solvency. I cannot, in good conscience, vote for a spending bill that advocates solvency while providing no replacement to ensure fair benefits for our public servants. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Is there any other member who wishes to move to strike the last word? The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Boyle, is recognized to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized.
I'd like to voice my strong support for H.R. 82, the Social Security Fairness Act. For far too long, these two Social Security Act provisions have unfairly reduced and eliminated benefits for millions of Americans, including countless constituents in my district who have devoted their lives and careers to public service. As of this past December, nearly 2 million Americans, or about 3% of all Social Security beneficiaries, were impacted by the windfall elimination provision. And at that same point, almost 750,000 Social Security beneficiaries had their benefits reduced by the GPO. The elimination of these two provisions would immediately benefit millions of retired firefighters, teachers, police officers, federal employees, and other public servants. So I thank every one of my colleagues on this committee, and I think we can all agree on just how important it is that we're having this conversation today and that finally action is taking place. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of H.R. 82, and I urge its passage and its report to the full House of Representatives so we can finally get this done. This is about fairness. It is time to stop penalizing public servants. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Are there other members who would like to move to strike the last word? The gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized.
When our colleague, Mr. Reed, chose to retire, I found myself getting the benefit of becoming the ranking member on Social Security. And along with having a brand new little baby that came out of nowhere, we'll explain that later, I spent my August with binders and binders on Social Security. I beg of you to understand the scale of the problem, the scale of the math, the scale of the demographics. Have you ever spent days reading something and then calling the experts and then calling the experts back and trying to get your head around a 75-year window, a couple $100 trillion of functional economic shortfall? I'm elated we're having this discussion. I beg of everyone to take seriousness the scale of what we must fix and must accomplish, because this is both just a cultural, moral, structural obligation we have. The issue on the web, we need to fix, but I would beg of us all to consider fixing it as one of the legs of a grand bargain, where it is part of the entire package, because we're going to all have to step up and do some things that are uncomfortable. We're going to have to go back and do our advanced math and put batteries in our calculators. But in this whole discussion, this is just one of many major Social Security issues it's time to deal with. It's time to basically step up and say, we're going to do some of the hardest work we've ever done. And that threshold is now upon us. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Are there other members who wish to strike the last word? Hearing none, now proceed to consideration of H.R. 82, and without objection, the measure will be considered as read. We are now prepared to proceed to the stage of amendments to H.R. 82. Is there any member who would like to seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Larson, is recognized to proceed with his
Chairman.
amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson, has reserved a point of order. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this has been a extraordinary conversation.
Mr. Larson, would you wait for a minute while we disperse with the, make sure the amendment is passed out? It's being passed out. Gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Larson, is recognized to proceed with his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've introduced amendment Social Security 2100, a sacred trust. Before I begin, again, I want to compliment President Biden for underscoring the importance and the need to repeal WEP and GPO. And again, thank Rodney Davis and Abigail Spanberger for their courage. As many of our colleagues have acknowledged today, the need for us to look at this in a comprehensive manner. I thank Mr. Schweikert, who just posed the question to the committee, and more importantly, when you hear Tom Rice speak about his mother, that's what this is all about. I would also add that the chairman of this committee also grew up and was weaned on Social Security, having lost his mother, his father, and then the grandmother that was caring for them. I never doubt his veracity and his commitment to Social Security. And WEP and GPO is vitally important. It's part of our comprehensive bill. And it's paid for because that's the way it should be. But we're talking about 2.7 million people. They need to be addressed. But to Mr. Schweikert's point, so do the 65 million people on Social Security currently. For 51 years, Congress has kicked the can down the road. Not just in the past decade, but for 51 years. As I said earlier, Sam Johnson had a proposal that was never allowed to come before this committee. So we're making progress. We need to have these discussions, and we need, most of all, to have a vote on these issues. Here's Social Security by the numbers. 65 million Americans are currently on it. 10,000 baby boomers a day become eligible for Social Security. And Gen Xers and Gen Zers will need it more than baby boomers. 2.3 million Americans get below poverty level checks from Social Security. Below poverty level checks in the wealthiest nation in the world. That has to be addressed. 23 million Americans deserve the tax cut that is in Social Security 2100 as they continue to work after they retire to make ends meet. The numbers are daunting. But this isn't about numbers. This is about Tom Rice's mother. This is about Richie Neal's mother and father and grandparents. This is about families all across the country. President Biden is right. This is a sacred trust, and it's our responsibility. This can't be done by executive order or or through the judicial branch. It only can be done in Congress. And in 51 years, Congress has not enhanced Social Security at all. In 1972, Richard Nixon was president, and a gallon of milk cost 72 cents. Everyone here knows this. This is a mirror test issue. Look in the mirror. You all know how many constituents you have in your district. And we are either going to vote on this issue in a comprehensive manner or kick the can down the road again. And if it's the election that's a bother, do it in the lame duck, but commit to the American people, to those seniors that are out there relying on us in the midst of a global pandemic, in the midst of inflation where everybody says, what are you going to do for inflation? You know the group we can help out. The people on fixed income, seniors in our country that need Congress's help. And either we'll talk the talk or walk the walk. But it's time we bring up comprehensive reform, and it's time this committee of consequence addresses it, and we urge the leadership to take it up on the floor and vote for those we're sworn to serve and protect. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Is there any other member who wishes to be heard on? Oh, did Mr. Thompson continue to reserve his point of order? Yes. Yes. Are there other members who would like to be heard on the amendment? No, that's it? Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Larson is
Mr.
recognized.
Chairman, it was my intent, and I thank you again, to withdraw this amendment, knowing that the amendment is non-germane. Though I think the issue is so germane and important to every family in America and everyone in this room. I yield back and thank you.
The amendment is withdrawn. Let me just acknowledge the good work, the passion that Mr. Larson has brought to this discussion, and it is timely, and he has worked very hard on this issue for a considerable period of time. Are there any further amendments? The gentleman from Texas, the ranking member, Mr. Brady, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I noted before, I would like to offer and withdraw the Equal Treatment of Public Servants Act of 2021. This bill, it's been discussed, so for the sake of time, this will be brief. But as you noted, in 2016, we together were very close to taking up and passing a similar bill that would provide immediate relief. I wish our teachers, police, and firefighters and our retirees would have that money in their pocket today. They don't. And I think it's important here that we do all that we can. Some, I think, have lost hope. I think it's important that we provide them hope that we can solve this. And so with that, Mr. Chairman, I withdraw that amendment and look for 2 points. Look forward to working with you on a solution that works. And secondly, as Republicans, we certainly look forward to working with Mr. Larson and anyone in a bipartisan way to save and strengthen Social Security. With that, I withdraw.
The gentleman has withdrawn his amendment. Are there any additional amendments to be offered at this time? Now let me recognize Mr. Thompson. Mr. Brady, would you like to continue?
Yes, I had asked unanimous consent to speak out of order briefly.
Gentleman is recognized.
So, Mr. Chairman, these new procedural rules are confusing to many, including to members of Congress. So to be clear, any motion to pass, for example, with no recommendation, it doesn't kill this bill, but removes it from the fast-track consensus calendar so the committee can work to fix the long-standing and very real unfairness and insolvency concerns in a way that ultimately helps it become the law of the land. No doubt the many co-sponsors and stakeholders of the bills will be disappointed, but the truth is, if you're not familiar with the complexity of Social Security, you wouldn't know that the bill inadvertently creates a massive new unfairness for the 96% of Americans, our constituents, who are in Social Security today, and actually accelerates the insolvency of this important program. No one wants that. So the obligation of this committee really is to take good intentions and common goals, which we share with this bill, and help them become law. I hope we'll all commit to addressing these in the weeks remaining in this year. I agree with you, Mr. Chairman, and these members. The time is now to create fairness for our public servants, and we need to get this done. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Now let me recognize Mr. Thompson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that the committee report H.R. 82 without recommendation to the House of Representatives.
The question is on reporting H.R. 82 without recommendation to the House of Representatives. All of those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed by saying no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. 82 is ordered without recommendation to the full House of Representatives. Thank you. Without objection, the staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. I thank the members for what I think was a very civil conversation. I also would point out that I think that the questions that have been raised here are entirely legitimate. We understand the challenges that are in front of us, and now perhaps a full engaged conversation will take place about this very issue. I remain committed. Mr. Brady and I have talked tens of times on this issue. We discussed it again this morning, and I just want to reiterate that we did have a proposal 4 years ago. It was taken down the morning of the vote because of our concern that it might not have passed the House of Representatives that day. The next order of business is House Resolution 1269. This resolution would require the Treasury Department to produce revenue modeling data and reports estimating the direct and indirect impact of OECD Pillar 1 agreement and the economic effects of the agreement to the United States Treasury. The Treasury Department has made progress on negotiating an agreement under Pillar 1 that would eliminate discriminatory digital services taxes and other unilateral tax measures that target U.S. companies. Members on both sides of the aisle have raised concerns about taxes that unfairly target U.S. companies, and I'm glad that the administration is working to address discriminatory taxes. With Secretary Yellen's leadership, we are closer than ever to a durable agreement. Although significant progress has been made, many options are open in the agreement, and the technical specifications of the agreement remain in flux. With so many fluid elements, any economic estimates will be based on premature assumptions about the details of the agreement. With so many fluid elements, any economic estimates will be based on premature assumptions about the details of the agreement. This resolution does nothing to help everyday Americans put food on the table, pay their bills, or take care of their families. The Democrats on the committee are focused on legislation that will help women, families, seniors, and all Americans. I urge my colleagues to report this resolution adversely. Let me recognize Mr. Brady for the purposes of an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I would yield my time to Mr. Hearn, the author of the resolution.
Mr. Hearn is recognized.
Thank the ranking member. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have a responsibility of oversight and to do our work as the Ways and Means Committee. And we're concerned by the Biden administration's unilateral effort to commit the United States to global tax policies that could make us less competitive on the global scale. This should concern all of us, and it does impact all of us in one form or another. They are grave consequences for our economy should we lose the competitive edge on corporate tax policy. Pillar 1 could very well be a global surrender of American tax sovereignty, and the tax writers of this committee deserve, both Democrats and Republicans deserve to know the details of the unilateral negotiations by this administration. Congressional Republicans have repeatedly asked for the basic revenue estimates on the proposed reallocation since the administration presented it to the OECD in April of 2021. We have asked in briefings with the Office of Tax Policy at the 2021 and 2022 budget hearings with Secretary Yellen and in written correspondence. The Treasury Department continues to provide inadequate answers and has deprived the nonpartisan Joint Committee on Taxation enough information to generate their own estimates. Republicans should not only be the ones concerned with how the Treasury's negotiations will affect the U.S. fisc and U.S. companies. All Americans should be concerned if the administration is proposing we send our taxing rights to countries like China and Russia. It's been a fool's errand for the administration to engage in the OECD digitalization tax agreement negotiations, well, without substantive bipartisan input from tax writing committees in the House and Senate. It is past time the Treasury shows some accountability for the OECD Pillar 1 agreement and be transparent with the tax writers on this committee. Again, Democrats and Republicans. I will assure my colleagues on the left that this administration's go-it-alone approach that fails to comply with the Constitution's demands will not produce a durable result at the OECD. Our international treaty network has worked well over the last century to promote bilateral trade, investment, and prosperity. Everyone on this committee understands the importance of progress on new global tax agreements, but Congress must approve any commitments that might erode the U.S. revenue base or significantly impact bilateral trade and investment flows. I urge my colleagues to report this resolution favorably, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman for his comments. Unless Mr. Brady wants to use the balance of that time.
Yes, sir.
Okay. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. Resolution 1269. Without objection, the measure is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Does anybody wish to move to strike the last word? The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you. I certainly want to thank my colleague for offering this resolution. We've seen that there is far more disagreement than agreement about implementation of OECD Pillars 1 and 2 internationally. Not only has the Biden administration failed to convince Congress to implement this agreement for our country, other entities like the EU have also failed to implement it. Even more alarming, we are already seeing countries who signed onto the OECD agreement looking for ways to undermine and even cheat the system. For example, both Canada and Denmark have implemented new local content taxes on streaming services if they don't procure enough content in those countries. Secretary Yellen wanted this flawed global tax agreement so badly that I think she gave a lot away. We deserve to know how much U.S. tax revenue Treasury believes she gave away in the process, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Is there any other member who wishes to move to strike the last word?
Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is one of the requests for information that the chairman deemed a waste of time of this hearing and a political stunt. We spent a lot of time in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act trying to figure out how to make America a competitive place to do business. And one of the primary ways we did that was by amending our international tax system and by lowering tax rates for multinationals so that America would be a good place to do business. And we stopped offshoring and we prevented millions of American jobs from going overseas. Very proud of the result of that bill. The result of that bill was lowest unemployment in decades among every demographic in our country, including African Americans, Hispanics, women, and so forth, and the lowest poverty ever on record, ever. Something we should all be very proud of. The Biden administration comes in and they want to undermine or potentially undermine all the progress that we made in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act by creating a new global tax system. Mr. Chairman, I think you referred to Ways and Means as the most consequential committee in Congress, and I want to believe that that's true. It has been the most consequential committee in Congress, but in this 2-year Congress, we've only had 15 hearings. 15. I think people back home expect us to do more than that. I think they expect us to hold real hearings and not just showpieces, and I think they expect us to explore things that could undermine our economic prosperity. And the fact that the majority here is willing to just turn over the reins on something so consequential as a global tax system when this committee is the committee of jurisdiction for taxes in this country. And we're willing to just turn over the reins to the Biden administration and say, go do what you need to do. You don't need to keep us apprised of it. All we want is information so that we can make reasonable decisions for our constituents back home. And we haven't had any hearings on this. We've had 15 hearings in 2 years. The majority should be ashamed. And the only reason the majority is turning their head the other way and letting the administration just do as you will is because Congress has devolved into red team, blue team. If they're on our team, we're not going to question what they're doing. Doesn't matter. Let them go ahead and do what they're going to do. We're not going to question it. Well, if you do that, Mr. Chairman, and that's what you're doing, if you do that, then I would hesitate to say that this committee is of so much consequence, because you're turning over the reins to the executive. All we want to know is what the executive branch is doing and whether it will undermine American competitiveness and whether it will once again start sending millions of American jobs overseas and whether it will once again undermine our economic growth, as this administration has done a great job of undermining our growth in the 2 years that they've been in office. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. LaHood, to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm supportive of Representative Hearn's resolution of inquiry requesting economic impact analysis performed by the Department of Treasury relating to the OECD Pillar 1 agreement. As elected representatives of the American people, we have a duty to make certain U.S. businesses and their workers are prioritized in all multilateral agreements negotiated by the executive branch. More specifically, as members of the Chief Tax Writing Committee in Congress, we should be kept informed of these international negotiations and their impact on the U.S. economy. The OECD agreement, Pillar 1, was supposed to end the worldwide escalation of digital service taxes, or DSTs, which disproportionately hurt American businesses and their workers. Addressing the DST issue was a bipartisan priority for most, if not all, of the members in this room. In the Treasury Department's press release announcing the OECD inclusion framework last fall, the administration stated that the agreement was, quote, a win for American businesses, which would no longer have to compete on the international playing field tilted against them, unquote. If that's true, why then isn't Congress allowed to see the analysis Treasury conducted to reach that conclusion? There is a real concern that Pillar 1, like DSTs, would unfairly harm the United States. Analysis conducted by the Oxford University Center for Business Taxation found that 64% of Amount A profits under Pillar 1 would come from U.S. headquartered companies. That sounds to me like an international playing field tilted very much against the United States. I urge my colleagues to support Rep. Hearn's resolution of inquiry requesting this economic impact analysis. Having more information about the potential effects of Pillar 1 as an alternative to DSTs should be something all of us in this room can support. Congress needs to be brought in on these negotiations so that we can help to ensure U.S. businesses and their employees are protected from potentially harmful changes regarding international tax. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Is there any other member who wishes to move to strike the last word? The gentleman from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you. I think it's very important that we all just kind of reflect and give context as to why we are here today. The resolutions of inquiry are an important oversight tool. They allow a member, regardless of political party, regardless of administration, to compel documents from that administration, whether it be from their party or not. It is something that we in Congress are supposed to do as oversight. And to be frank, it's one of the last tools available to the minority to hold the majority and the administration accountable, again, regardless of party. Yet what we are seeing in this administration is an unprecedented abuse of power. When the Speaker ushered in proxy voting under the guise of the public health emergency, she did not care what institutional norms she bulldozed to achieve her goal of consolidating power. We have had some members who have rarely been here in the last 2 years. It's absolutely absurd. She threw out the motion to recommit, which was the minority's right to offer an amendment to legislation on the floor. This is a bipartisan country, and she's actually turned it into just another abuse of power. And for 790 days, Speaker Pelosi turned off the mechanism for resolutions of inquiry to be considered. 790 days. These tools were not simply institutional norms. They are available so that we all regardless of party, can best represent our constituents. And the Speaker of the House's short-sighted decisions trampled on those constituents' voices. To put it plain and simple, this was and continues to be a frank abuse of power. And that's just not happening in the People's House. It's happening in the administration and in the White House. On Sunday, the president declared the pandemic was over, but he's continued to use his emergency powers. This pandemic should have been over 9 months ago. The administration has shown time and time again that they can and will use these powers to weaponize their radical agenda. Let me just give you a few examples. You know, the public health emergency, a national emergency, was put in by the Trump administration appropriately at the time. They did the right thing. But what we've seen since then are frank abuses of power under the guise of the national health emergency and the public health emergency, things that were otherwise not constitutional. For example, the student loan giveaway. It's really a transfer of debt to those people who did not benefit from it, and it's a transfer of that debt to taxpayers who want nothing to do with this. Second, on the public health emergency, let me just give everybody a little bit of a fact here. No state is allowed to audit their Medicaid rolls. When I was back in our state house, I was senior chair of health policy. We audited our Medicaid rolls every year because individuals end up being on the rolls and they no longer qualify. So now, since for the last 2 years, no state has been able to audit their Medicaid rolls, now to the tune that 1 in 4 Americans is on Medicaid. That's absolutely an abuse of power. It's not needed, and it's a wrong use of taxpayers' money. The courts have struck down several of the unconstitutional measures by this president and the administration. This is why these resolutions are so important. They allow the minority to ask tough questions and conduct proper oversight, again, regardless of party. So while I'm sure that we'll hear from some friends about that we're using obstruction and delay tactics, it's absolutely wrong. And in a true essence, we're guaranteeing the other party its time in a future date to ask these same questions. Our constituents sent us here to hear their voices, regardless of party, and that's what we should be doing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy. There are other members who wish to strike the last word. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you. Did it again. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Representative Hearn for introducing this amendment. It's a common sense amendment that I think every member of this committee should support, and I hope we have that happen today. We simply want to know the information that the Secretary used, the information she's relying on when she talks about these proposals as being roughly revenue neutral. We're concerned that there's not transparency in her proposals. There's not transparency in the global tax negotiations and the jurisdictional changes that will result from OECD's Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 agreements. Pillar 1 will apply a digital tax on the largest companies in the world, but based on how that pillar is written, we believe that the biggest tax burden, in fact, almost exclusively the tax burden, will be levied on American companies. We're deeply concerned that these tax rule changes could result in fewer American jobs and increased costs for consumers. And again, as I mentioned, Secretary Yellen has gone on record stating that she believes the proposal will be roughly revenue neutral, quote. But how did she arrive at that conclusion? That's what we're asking. We've been asking for that information of Treasury. We've been asking them to share their analysis since April of last year, but have received nothing. And I believe our constituents have the right to understand how Treasury evaluated the implications of Pillar 1 when signing us up for it. So I hope to see today the support of all of my colleagues on this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Is there any other member who wishes to strike the last word? Are there any amendments? And if not, the chair is prepared to recognize Mr. Thompson.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report H. Res. 1269 adversely to the House of Representatives.
The question is on reporting H.R. Resolution 1269 adversely to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye. Mr. Chairman, I request the yeas and nays.
We can also have a no vote in terms of the question. Then we will proceed to you, Mr. Hearn, rapidly.
Just didn't want to
All
miss
those
my
opposed,
opportunity
no.
there. Okay.
You didn't. All opposed, no.
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 The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I request a recorded vote, please.
The gentleman from Oklahoma has requested a recorded vote, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett. Mr. Thompson.
Aye.
Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes yes. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer votes aye. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind votes aye. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell votes aye. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Sanchez.
Aye.
Ms. Sanchez votes aye. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes aye. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Dalbene. Ms. Dalbene votes aye. Ms. Chu.
Aye.
There have been no. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee votes aye. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle votes aye. Mr. Byer. Mr. Evans.
Aye.
Mr. Evans votes aye. Mr. Schneider.
Aye.
Mr. Schneider votes aye. Mr. Swazi.
Aye.
Mr. Swazi votes aye. Mr. Panetta.
Aye.
Mr. Panetta votes aye. Ms. Murphy.
Aye.
Ms. Murphy votes aye.
When we issue suspicious activity reports, it's not just thrown out like a mere bag of shells. It's done for specific reasons.
Gomez, aye.
Concerns about criminality.
Mr. Gomez.
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Plaskett.
Aye.
Ms. Plaskett votes aye. Mr. Brady.
No.
Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Buchanan.
No.
Mr. Buchanan votes no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
No.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes no. Mr. Kelly.
No.
Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Smith of Missouri. Mr. Smith of Missouri votes no. Mr. Rice. Mr. Rice votes no. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert votes no. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood votes no. Dr. Wenstrup. Dr. Wenstrup votes no. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes no. Dr. Ferguson. Mr. Estes.
No.
Mr. Estes votes no. Mr. Smucker.
No.
Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Hearn.
No.
Mr. Hearn votes no. Mrs. Miller.
No.
Mrs. Miller votes no. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff votes no. Mr. Doggett.
Aye.
Mr. Doggett votes aye. Ms. Sewell. Mr. Byer. Mr. Byer votes aye. Dr. Ferguson? Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
Is the clerk prepared to report the tally?
Mr. Chair, I have 24 ayes, 16 noes.
There being 24 ayes and 16 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. Resolution 1269 is ordered reported adversely to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff are authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is House Resolution 1285. This resolution will require the President to provide certain documents and correspondence relating to The recent decision by members of the World Trade Organization to waive certain intellectual property protections for COVID-19 vaccines, specifically the resolution requests information related to the impact of the waiver on COVID-19 pandemic vaccines and therapeutics. The COVID-19 pandemic is indeed a global health crisis. Let me remind our colleagues that since the beginning of the pandemic, civil society groups and many WTO members have pressed for accommodations to intellectual property rules for COVID-19 vaccines. To facilitate the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, the United States Trade Representative worked with our trading partners to ensure that trade rules support the global response to the pandemic. These efforts included a waiver of intellectual property protections for COVID-19 vaccines. In this regard, I would note that all WTO members have agreed to the waiver. Specifically, WTO members agreed that developing countries can waive WTO patent rights for the production and supply of COVID-19 vaccines for the next 5 years. This waiver, as is acknowledged by resolutions, does not apply to China. Finally, I would note that the Biden administration believes strongly in intellectual property protections in the service of ending COVID-19 pandemic. However, the administration did work with WTO members to craft a temporary waiver for vaccines. The administration's goal here is to get as many safe and effective vaccines to as many people as possible. This resolution does not help everyday Americans put food on the table, pay their bills, or take care of their families. Many Democrats continue to be focused on legislation that will help women, families, seniors, and all Americans. I urge our colleagues to report this resolution adversely. Let me recognize Mr. Brady for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I will yield my time to the author of the resolution, Mr. Smith of Nebraska. Excuse me.
The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Brady. This resolution requests the President send certain information to the House relating to a waiver of intellectual property commitments, emphasis commitments, under the WTO TRIPS agreement. Specifically, the resolution requests information demonstrating that the TRIPS waiver will increase global supply of COVID vaccines, the extent to which COVID vaccines have been destroyed due to their expiration, the proposed TRIPS waiver expansion to cover diagnostics and therapeutics will increase supply, and whether the People's Republic of China will obtain access to IP related to COVID vaccines, diagnostics, or therapeutics, even if China is expressly excluded. Colleagues on both sides of the aisle should agree that the scope of this request is very narrowly tailored. Regardless of individual member views on the TRIPS waiver, this resolution deserves bipartisan support so this committee can analyze the efficacy of the waiver and whether or not it should be expanded to include diagnostics and therapeutics. I will also add that bipartisan agreement consultations with Congress on the TRIPS waiver by the Biden administration were seriously lacking. Amazingly, the administration never actually shared its views with Congress until it had already agreed to the waiver at the WTO. Now we find ourselves in the exact same position once again with respect to therapeutics and diagnostics, despite the president's own admission the pandemic is over. Still, the TRIPS waiver includes a 6-month period for WTO members to, quote, decide on its extension to cover the production of supply of COVID-19 diagnostics and therapeutics, end quote. We are already halfway through this six-month period, yet the administration has not yet consulted with this committee or taken a position on an expanded waiver, nor have they shared any analysis on the impact of even expanding the waiver. We cannot once again learn about the administration's position on an IP waiver after a final agreement. If we are serious about the Congress' primary jurisdiction over international trade, we must insist Congress remain in the driver's seat. I urge all my colleagues to report the resolution favorably and certainly urge bipartisan cooperation. Thank you. I yield.
Thank the gentleman. Are there other members who would like to move to strike the last word? The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. LaHood, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank Representative Adrian Smith for this timely and substantive resolution to request further information on the waiver of intellectual property commitments under the WTO agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property. Very important. Before the 12th WTO ministerial early this year, I, along with many of my colleagues on this committee, expressed concern for the U.S. position on this agreement and its potential to harm longstanding U.S. intellectual property rights and future innovation. As we all know, strong IP protections have facilitated the research and development of new therapeutics and have enabled hundreds of voluntary partnerships to allow for the sharing of technology and information to scale up vaccine manufacturing around the world. For these reasons, I opposed the initial WTO agreement which relates to vaccine production. However, I am even more concerned about the possibility left in the agreement to broaden the waiver for diagnostics and therapeutics. This is an unnecessary expansion and a slippery slope towards allowing adversaries like China access to U.S. intellectual property. Moving forward, we must ensure appropriate congressional oversight over the Biden administration on this issue, and this resolution does that. I continue to support a balanced approach, and I have led bipartisan letters, most recently with my colleague, Rep. Jimmy Panetta, to the administration asking them to focus on supply chain resiliency to support international vaccine delivery efficiency and treatment access, while also supporting innovation. Moving forward, we must look at ways to strengthen our supply chains and support research, development, and innovation. Congress should be updated frequently on the negotiations of the Biden administration on this issue so we can protect our national security, intellectual property, and access to future treatments, therapeutics, and diagnostics. I fully support Representative Smith's resolution of inquiry as a common sense tool to ensure appropriate congressional oversight. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Are there other members who wish to strike the last word? The gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
You know, this has been a difficult and challenging effort. We have seen internationally the strength of the pharmaceutical industry to choke off opportunities to be able to expand vaccine activities. That's why hundreds of civil society groups, members of organized labor, faith groups, even the Pope have backed the TRIPS waiver as a critical aspect of global health strategy needed to make possible a robust global economic recovery. I appreciate the administration taking a whole of government approach to ending the COVID pandemic, including working with our trading partners to ensure that trade rules support a global response to the pandemic. Now, Pfizer sold $36.7 billion of the COVID vaccine in 2021. Moderna sold $17.1 billion. Both companies have forecast similar revenues in 2022. The pharmaceutical industry has made their plans clear, resisting efforts in moving forward, talking openly about significant opportunities to raise prices of their vaccine as the global transitions to annual boosters. It means that, candidly, poor developing nations will miss out. A TRIPS waiver will more equitably distribute vaccines globally, not just to the richest nations. It will stop the proliferation of new variants around the world by quickly ramping up supply in every corner. We have a stake in being able to end this pandemic globally. And until we do this globally, nobody is going to be safe. I sincerely believe that there are opportunities for us to be able to move forward to expand supplies. I frankly take the notion that somehow we have to hold the rest of the globe hostage in the name of innovation is overblown. There is a reason why we've moved forward in the past selectively. We can do so in the future. Having the TRIPS waiver approved by the WTO was an extraordinary development. It required unanimous support. I think we ought not to chip away at that. We ought to build on it moving forward. There are areas where we need to increase our opportunities to expand access to vaccines. This is the least we can do.
I thank the gentleman. Other members wishing to strike the last word. The gentleman from Ohio, Dr. Winstrup, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Twice in this committee, I urged Ambassador Tai to reconsider the Biden administration's decision to support a waiver of key IP protections for COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics. Despite the strong concerns raised here by Ways and Means Committee members, the administration went through with the damaging decision to agree to an IP waiver at the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference earlier this summer. As a physician, co-chair of the Doctors Caucus, I was very actively engaged with the Operation Warp Speed team throughout the vaccine trials and development. I recognize the value in encouraging people across the world to consult with a medical professional about the COVID-19 vaccine. It's both a humanitarian imperative to help countries, as well as a necessary step to increase our collective health security here in the United States. But to my knowledge, there has been absolutely no evidence presented that the IP waiver agreed to by WTO members earlier this year will have any impact on the ability of developing nations to secure more doses of vaccine. On the contrary, I'm concerned that the waiver could actually disrupt complex, tightly coordinated supply chains and allow new unlicensed producers to enter the marketplace with vaccines and other products that may not meet the same rigorous standards and safety precautions and quality standards that currently authorized vaccines and therapeutics must meet. It's a dangerous step. Additionally, the waiver inaccurately implies that IP is hindering the response to the COVID-19 pandemic and weakens core IP principles enshrined in the World Trade Organization's agreements, while distracting from the true constraints such as inadequate healthcare and distribution infrastructure. Concerningly, the waiver agreement reached by the WTO members in June contains a clause which raises the possibility that IP protections could also be waived for therapeutics and diagnostics, which would do further harm to core IP principles and raise the possibility that adversarial nations could receive access to even more sensitive U.S. technology beyond vaccines. It's absolutely critical that we favorably report this resolution so that the House of Representatives can gain access to any materials which provide background and context on the administration's decision to waive IP rights for COVID-19 vaccines. Congress has a constitutional duty to regulate commerce with foreign nations, a responsibility which has been seriously abridged by the administration's unilateral decision to waive aspects of the TRIPS agreement without congressional approval. We should all be hesitant to allow that to happen. I hope that my colleagues will support this resolution and reassert Congress's power over international trade and our responsibilities when it comes to international trade. That, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize other members who wish to move to strike the last word. Mr. Smucker from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was American ingenuity that developed safe and effective vaccines and therapeutics under Operation Warp Speed that put this country through got this country through the pandemic. Now, I worry that the TRIPS waiver hinders that spirit of innovation and investment that has America as a global leader in biotechnology development. We certainly all supportive of broad access to COVID-19 vaccines for those who want them. And this resolution just simply requests that the administration show its work, provide the documentation that the Biden administration's TRIPS waiver plan would actually meet its goals. And my question is, if the administration, if Democrats are so confident that the TRIPS waiver will meet its promises, then why should there be a problem supporting this resolution? Again, I'm concerned the TRIPS waiver guts the intellectual property protections necessary for future development, leaving us potentially at greater risk in the event of another pandemic. It's unnecessary as well. The Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recently called on the U.S. to pause donations of vaccines to the continent, noting that current challenges are on getting shots in arms, not in the supply of vaccines needed. So before this administration explores expanding the TRIPS waiver to therapeutics and diagnostics, we should be able to see the administration's evidence that the waiver today is operating as intended. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Are there other members who would like to strike the last word? The gentleman from Georgia, Dr. Ferguson, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would hope that everybody on this committee would support
this inquiry. And getting to the process of how the administration decided to give away intellectual property, I think is an important oversight question for this committee. But I think giving away our intellectual property is an absolutely horrible precedent to set. One of the witnesses last week, Professor Wu, Dr. Wu from Harvard, said in his response, in one of the responses, that any trade agreement that we have going forward should have very, very strong intellectual property protections in it. Not give it away. His words, his position. And I agree with him on that. And keep in mind that this technology is just not about COVID-19. This technology can be used in a lot of other ways, and it's taken decades to develop. And to simply give this technology away and this intellectual property away, and it could wind up in the hands of bad actors, is not the right thing. And let's talk practically about what it would mean. Let's just say that a company decided that they were going to take on this intellectual property. Well, I mean, think about what would have to happen in order for that company to produce vaccines safely. They've got to go out and find a site to build a facility. They have to build a facility. They've got to hire. They've got to get the machinery in place. God knows how long that's going to take with the supply chain issues that we've got. They've got to train a workforce, and they've got to develop the product. We can do that so much more quickly right here in America. We should be doing that. We should, if the issue is to get more vaccines out, well, let's get more vaccines out the door. But let's not give away our intellectual property. That is wrong. It hurts American innovation, and it really does create the environment where innovators are not going to feel comfortable producing the product, innovating and producing the products here in America. Because what's to say that the federal government won't come take their stuff and give it to somebody else? It's a horrible precedent to set. It's not going to have the impact that the administration believes that it will, and we should fight back hard against doing this. I mean, what's next? Are we going to give away our intellectual property on cybersecurity? Are we going to give away our intellectual property on new technologies for cleaner energy? Are we going to give away everything that we invent in this great country? It's our competitive advantage. We should be doing everything possible to put America and Americans first, not giving away our intellectual property. We should fight hard against doing that. We can provide the vaccines. We can provide the testing, the diagnostics. We can do that. We should do that. We should invent things here in America. We should make things here in America, and we should sell it to the rest of the world. We shouldn't invent it and then give it away to folks that really, quite candidly, may mean to do us harm in the future. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Are there other members who wish to strike the last word? The gentlelady from West Virginia, Ms. Miller, is recognized to strike the last word.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Neal and Ranking Member Brady. Like so many of my colleagues, I'm extremely concerned about the TRIPS waiver. The Biden administration has seemed hell-bent on sharing our country's IP with the world. However, sharing our IP does very little to ensure vaccines are actually going in arms. What we should be focusing on is strong supply chains and distribution channels. Further, this unprecedented move by the administration could have long-term effects on American innovation. We need to be encouraging companies to continue to be on the cutting edge of medicine. However, if sharing their IP could chill future therapies and cures, they need to be careful. We must ensure that the administration is doing their due diligence on this waiver. I urge my colleagues to report the resolution favorably. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Are there other members who would like to strike the last word? We are now prepared to move to amendments, and if there are no amendments, we're prepared to proceed. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report HRES 1285 adversely to the House of Representatives.
The question is on reporting HR Resolution 1285 adversely to the House. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. And
Mr.
HR
Chairman,
Gentleman from Nebraska is recognized.
I request a record vote.
The gentleman from Nebraska has requested a recorded vote, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Doggett.
Aye.
Mr. Doggett votes aye. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes aye. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer votes aye. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind votes aye. Mr. Pasquale. Mr. Pasquale votes aye. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Sanchez.
Aye.
Ms. Sanchez votes aye. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes aye. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Delbene. Ms. Delbene votes aye. Ms. Chu.
Aye.
Ms. Chu votes aye. Ms. Moore. Ms. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee votes aye. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle votes aye. Mr. Byer. Mr. Evans.
Aye.
Mr. Evans votes aye. Mr. Schneider.
Aye.
Mr. Schneider votes aye. Mr. Swazi. Mr. Swazi votes aye. Mr. Panetta.
Aye.
Mr. Panetta votes aye. Ms. Murphy. Mr. Gomez.
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Plaskett. Ms. Plaskett votes aye. Mr. Brady. Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Buchanan.
No.
Mr. Buchanan votes no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska.
No.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes no. Mr. Kelly.
No.
Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Smith of Missouri. Mr. Smith of Missouri votes no. Mr. Rice. Mr. Rice votes no. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert votes no. Mr. LaHood. Mr. LaHood votes no. Dr. Wenstrup. Dr. Wenstrup votes no. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes no. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson votes no. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes no. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Hearn.
No.
Mr. Hearn votes no. Mrs. Miller.
No.
Mrs. Miller votes no. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff votes no. Ms. Sewell. Mr. Byer. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
Clerk will report the tally. If there are no other members who wish to be recorded. There's Mr. Byer. We will recognize Mr. Byer.
Mr.
Clerk will
Byer?
suspend. Mr. Byer.
Mr. Byer votes yes. Mr. Chair, I have 23 ayes, 17 noes.
On this vote, the ayes are 23 and the noes are 17. The motion is agreed to. HR Resolution 1285 is ordered, reported adversely to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff are authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and members have 2 additional days to file with committee clerk supplemental additional dissenting or minority views. Our next order of business is House Resolution 1262. This resolution directs the Secretary of Health and Human Services to provide certain documents and correspondence between the White House and HHS relating to the reinterpretation of the tax credit for coverage under the Qualified Health Plan and requirements to maintain minimum essential health coverage. Aside from the nature of this resolution, there are several problematic details with it as a measure. To begin with, the resolution is directed at the wrong federal agency. The Department of Health and Human Services is not in charge of interpreting the Affordable Care Act provisions contained in the Internal Revenue Code. That responsibility lies solely with the Department of Treasury and Internal Revenue Service. Here, the regulation at issue falls under Section 36B of the Internal Revenue Code. Furthermore, this resolution would not do anything to help lower healthcare costs for hardworking American families. And as I have made clear in my letter to Treasury and IRS, I strongly support proposed regulations that would allow millions of Americans with unaffordable employer-sponsored coverage to access premium tax credits in the ACA marketplaces. This regulation is also consistent with the statutory text and congressional intent behind ACA. I welcome our colleagues on the other side to work with us to strengthen ACA and do more to reduce healthcare costs for families. At the moment, they have refused to do that. I find it somewhat ironic that our colleagues now seem interested in conducting oversight related to ACA. Why were they not in the last administration attempting to strengthen the protections for ACA instead of making changes, including junk plans? This resolution does nothing to help everyday Americans put food on the table, pay their bills, or take care of their families. Our committee Democrats are focused on legislation that will help women, families, seniors, and all members of the American family. I urge my colleagues to report this resolution adversely. Let me recognize Mr. Brady for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time to the author of the resolution, Mr. Buchanan of Florida.
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Buchanan, is recognized on the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're here today because in April, President Obama chose to expand Obamacare with a stroke of a pen. In the past, I might have called this action unprecedented, but President Biden put this type of a congressional sidestepping developed by President Obama on steroids. A decade ago, the Obama administration worked to implement the massive boondoggle known as Obamacare. At that time, congressional Democrats and outside groups put significant pressure on President Obama to use the executive action to expand the definition of affordable to determine eligibility for premium tax credits. Despite the pressure, the Obama administration decided it couldn't legally expand the definition of affordability because the statute was clear and only a subsequent act of Congress could rewrite the law. Ironically, President Obama was featured at the White House celebrating with President Biden announcement he was reversing his old boss decision and moving forward with this illegal expansion. The statute is clear. It doesn't contain a glitch, or some have claimed. Democrats wrote this bill to get it passed. Even members of their own party knew it was flawed, claiming that the administration is fixing a glitch. It's false. Rewriting a statute by executive action a decade later is an affront to the rule of law and blazing violation of the separation of powers. Career lawyers at the government agency don't typically overturn a decade of precedent like this. This is why we believe the decision was pushed on them from the top and why we want their communication with the White House. It's likely the White House pushed these agencies to reverse prior decisions for political reasons, and we believe that the American public is on the hook for another $45 billion over the next decade. It should be looked into. That's our point. As inflation rages and prices of food and energy remain high, the Biden administration continues to pour gasoline on the inflationary fire. At the rate, as I mentioned before, at $45 billion, the taxpayers are going to have to deal with. The administration needs to be held accountable, and Congress needs to assert its authority on oversight issues. For this reason, I urge my colleagues to report the recommendation favorably. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Are there other members who wish to be recognized to strike the last word?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rice. The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, is recognized to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, the Biden administration has taken President Obama's pen and phone approach to government and turned the volume up to 11. The decision to simply rewrite Obamacare and expand it at a cost of $45 billion is an affront to the separation of powers, and something that this committee, if it were acting as it should, in oversight of the administration and protecting the role of Congress in our government as set forth in the Constitution, we would be very interested in. Unfortunately, we're getting this type of behavior with this administration over and over. It was only last month the administration announced its plan to cancel hundreds of billions of dollars in student loan debt with the stroke of a pen. This is absurd. And of course, Congress should be holding hearings and doing whatever it can to prevent the administration from these unconstitutional, illegal executive actions. But because Congress is in the control of the blue team and the administration's on the blue team, we happily sit on our hands and turn our heads as the administration flouts the rule of law. Even Speaker Pelosi recognized that the president doesn't have the legal authority to cancel hundreds of billions of dollars in student loan debt any more than they have to expand Obamacare outside of the law at a cost of $45 billion. And yet we sit on our hands silently and do nothing. We had only 15 hearings in 2 years and ignore the duty that our people back home elected us to do. When asked about the president canceling student loan debt, Pelosi said it would take an act of Congress, not an executive order, to cancel student loan debt. But the president did it anyway, and Speaker Pelosi has made no effort to move legislation through Congress to block this effort, and nor has this committee. These actions by the Biden administration will continue unless Congress reasserts itself to prevent abuses of power by limiting the executive branch from exercising the core functions reserved to it. Mr. Chairman, you referred to this committee as the most consequential committee in Congress, and yet we sit on our hands and ignore the fact that the administration continues to break the law simply because the majority's on the blue team and the administration's on the blue team, and therefore they can do whatever they want, and we will simply remain quiet and not have any hearings and not conduct our legitimate oversight. It is an affront to our duty to our constituents, and it is an affront to our duties under the Constitution. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Word. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Schmucker, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The administration is at it again, shifting the goalposts, whether it be on recognizing inflation, how to define a recession, or the crisis at the southern border. This administration often doesn't level with the American people. Here we have yet another example of President Biden's willingness to bend the rules in his favor when examining this executive overreach to, quote, fix the family glitch. When Obamacare was first enacted, the premium tax credit subsidies were designed to prohibit family members of an employee with affordable employer-sponsored coverage from qualifying for the subsidies. President Obama determined that the law was clear and that any changes to extend subsidies to family members would require a change in the law. So what has changed? President Biden just simply decides to reverse that interpretation and through executive overreach spend billions of taxpayer dollars. This is the committee that has jurisdiction over policies impacting our healthcare markets. That, by the way, was the opinion of the Obama administration as well. It is our duty to completely understand how the administration can spend $45 billion and further discourage employer-sponsored insurance in favor of more government interference in healthcare. All this resolution asks is that the Biden administration show their work and clearly explain how they came to believe they had the authority to bypass Congress. It's my hope that Democrats, if they support this resolution, we can then have a robust debate on the merits of the policy and whether it actually improves access to care. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentleman. Are there other members who wish to move to strike the last word? Hearing none, we are prepared to proceed to the amendment phase. If there are no amendments, the chair would recognize the gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report H-Res 1262 adversely to the House of Representatives.
The question is on reporting H.R. Resolution 1262 adversely to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded
The gentleman
vote.
from Florida has requested a recorded vote. The clerk will tally the roll.
Mr. Doggett.
Aye.
Mr. Doggett votes aye. Mr. Thompson.
Aye.
Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes aye. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer votes aye. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind votes aye. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell votes aye. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Sanchez.
Aye.
Ms. Sanchez votes aye. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes aye. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Delbene.
Aye.
Ms. Delbene votes aye. Ms. Chu.
Aye.
Ms. Chu votes aye. Ms. Moore.
Aye.
Ms. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee votes aye. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle votes aye. Mr. Byer. Mr. Byer votes aye. Mr. Evans.
Aye.
Mr. Evans votes aye. Mr. Schneider.
Aye.
Mr. Schneider votes aye. Mr. Swazi.
Aye.
Mr. Swazi votes aye. Mr. Panetta.
Show us the document.
Mr. Panetta votes aye.
We do
Ms.
this.
Murphy.
This Congress should force him to do that. And that's what we should do. And I'm not going to
Ms.
thank
Murphy.
you for this. I'm going to simply say, do your job.
Aye.
Ms. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Gomez.
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Mr. Horsford. Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Plaskett. Ms. Plaskett votes aye. Mr. Brady.
Mr. Brady votes no.
Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Buchanan.
No.
Mr. Buchanan votes no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska. Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes no. Mr. Kelly.
No.
Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Smith of Missouri. Mr. Rice. Mr. Rice votes no. Mr. Schweikert. Mr. Schweikert votes no. Mr. LaHood. Dr. Wenstrup. Dr. Wenstrup votes no. Mr. Arrington. Mr. Arrington votes no. Dr. Ferguson. Dr. Ferguson votes no. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes votes no. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Hearn. Mr. Hearn votes no. Mrs. Miller.
No.
Mrs. Miller votes no. Dr. Murphy. Dr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Kustoff. Mr. Kustoff votes no. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell votes aye. Mr. Smith of Missouri. Mr. LaHood.
Mr. LaHood votes no.
Mr. LaHood votes no. Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman votes aye. Mr. Chair, I have 25 ayes, 16 noes.
There being 25 ayes and 16 noes, the motion is agreed to. HR Resolution 1262 is ordered reported adversely to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff are authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and members will have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is House Resolution 1283 relating to the Internal Revenue Service's decision to destroy 30 million paper information returns in March of 2021. In September 2021, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration publicly reported that the IRS destroyed about 30 million paper information returns earlier that year. These information returns were primarily from the tax year 2019 and were being processed in 2020. They were destroyed because the IRS has an antiquated system that did not allow these returns to be processed after the end of the year. The IRS also needed to use the same computer system to process business returns needed to provide COVID relief, which had a higher priority at the end of 2020. The returns destroyed amounted to less than 1% of the 3.2 billion information returns processed by the IRS in 2020. The IRS has stated that the destruction of these forms will have no impact on taxpayers. The IRS provided an extensive bipartisan briefing to the committee on this matter. Subsequently, the IRS told the committee that the documents sought by this resolution would wholly jeopardize voluntary compliance. The IRS further told the committee that it is not releasing the document as the release represents a significant risk to the agency. This resolution does nothing to help everyday Americans put food on the table, pay their bills, or take care of their families. The committee Democrats remain focused on legislation and policies that help women, families, seniors, and indeed all Americans. I urge our colleagues to report this resolution adversely. Let me recognize Mr. Brady for the purposes of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield my time to the author of the resolution, Mr. Rice, South Carolina.
The gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The resolution is simple. Last year, the IRS decided to destroy 30 million paper information returns, and we want to understand why. Most of the returns were information returns used to cross-check tax filings to confirm their veracity. Most were filed by small businesses and individuals simply trying to comply with the ever-increasing burden of the federal government. We have questions about why this decision was made, what implications it has for tax administration, and whether policy changes are necessary to avoid this problem in the future. If 30 million paper information returns can simply be destroyed with no consequence, we have questions about whether those forms should be filed at all. During our oversight of this issue, we learned the IRS weighed the pros and cons of this decision in a memorandum. Our staff asked for a copy of the memorandum, but the IRS refused to provide a copy of the document because they said release of the document would reveal sensitive IRS information. If true, this is perfectly reasonable concern for the IRS to express, but congressional oversight does not end there. Agencies cannot avoid congressional oversight simply by saying there's a risk to the agency. The next step in the process includes negotiating to an alternative accommodation that still allows Congress to conduct oversight while protecting the information the agency considers sensitive. But to date, the IRS has refused to engage in negotiations on this front, and this committee refuses to move forward because it's under the Biden administration. Our staff requested this memorandum on May the 17th. Ranking Member Brady sent a letter about this issue on June 13th and reiterated our request for the memorandum. Mr. Chairman, I ask this letter be included in the record.
So ordered.
To date, the IRS has not responded to Ranking Member Brady's June 13th letter. Last week, our staff reached out to the agency to try to resolve the issue and avoid proceeding with this resolution. The IRS, however, did not make time for a phone call with staff to discuss the issue, and they made no indication of a willingness to make an accommodation. This is unacceptable. Congressional oversight is one of the most important responsibilities of Congress, and when an agency is uncooperative, Congress must use all available tools to fulfill its oversight responsibility. I have consistently pressed the IRS on their confounding inability to modernize their technology, despite being provided $300 million annually to do so. I believe had their technology been up to date, these returns would have been used as intended and the destruction of the returns would not have occurred. Moreover, oversight of the IRS's decision-making will become even more important now that the IRS has received $80 billion in mandatory funding as provided by the IRA bill that the Democrats just ran through Congress over the next 10 years and plans to hire 87,000 new employees. I hope that the Democrats will at least agree to some measure of oversight over this new army of IRS agents. Republicans in Congress will continue to conduct oversight of the IRS with all tools at our disposal. Mr. Chairman, you referred to my resolution as a political stunt and a waste of this committee's time. I wonder if the millions of small business owners and individuals who wasted millions of hours preparing these returns only to have the IRS destroy them would agree with that. I urge my colleagues to report this resolution favorably. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Are there other members who wish to move to strike the last word? The gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Smucker, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank Mr. Rice for introducing this resolution. You know, it's one of the most frustrating things for me, one of the things that we hear from constituents about more than anything else, the delays in processing at the IRS. I have constituents who still have not received their refunds from 2019. And at the same time, then the IRS was the last federal agency to bring its employees back to the office. So while they kept their employees at home, they are not serving the needs of constituents. And I would guess every member up here is hearing the same thing from folks in their districts. And then the Democrats just passed this with the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which will dedicate $80 billion to the IRS, as Mr. Rice just said. But the large portion of that will go towards enforcement rather than improving the processes at the IRS and ensuring that they're more responsive and more timely with the American people. And then I think it's just inconceivable that the IRS would resort to destroying paper documents rather than working to bring their employees back into the office. So I think the American taxpayers deserve to know what's going on, why this happened, and this resolution would be instrumental in getting answers for our constituents. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Are there other members who would like to strike the last word? Dr. Ferguson is recognized to strike the last word.
Mr. Chairman, before I get into my questions, can we go back to your opening statement on this?
I anticipate you will.
No, you had a line in there that said that this caused security issues for the IRS. Do you mind?
I am repeating the words of the IRS as they
Correct.
have instructed us.
Would you mind reading that again for us?
If we could find it, as you want to proceed, then I will find it here and we'll go back and do it again.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Because if there's security concerns with an agency, I certainly think that we as members of Congress in our oversight capacity should dig down into that and understand that, especially for an agency that has been one of the largest purchaser of firearms and ammunition. If they're concerned about their security and safety and having to purchase that much weaponry, and we got 87,000 new agents coming on, this thing just deserves some attention. But I want to go back to something and reiterate a point that my colleague, Mr. Smucker, touched on, and that is the fact that the customer service and the advocacy for the taxpayer at the IRS is just almost non-existent at this point. You've talked about hiring 87,000 additional agents, okay, which is, I hear about this from my constituents back home all the time. They know what's fixing to happen. They are about to be, they feel the weight of the federal government coming down on them for no reason. But why aren't we focusing on doing the things on getting the back returns taken care of? Why aren't we focusing on making sure that the IRS employees are fully back in the office working? Why aren't we making sure that we're doing things on behalf of the American people instead of doing things to the American people? So, this, I agree with Mr. Rice as well. This is not a political stunt. This is legitimate oversight that this committee should be doing to understand why 30 million documents just got destroyed, okay, without asking the question. I mean, if there are good reasons, hey, let's talk about that. But shouldn't we ask that question, and shouldn't the IRS, shouldn't we be able to dig down more deeply into that? I think this is, I would encourage everyone to support this. And Mr. Chairman, if you're ready to read that.
When the gentleman relinquishes his time.
Okay. With that, I will reserve the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman. So in a memo an email that was sent to the Republican staff director on this issue, let me read verbatim. In response to your request, I'm advised the document includes information on what data is transcribed or not transcribed, timing of case selection, as well as what data can be matched or not matched. Access to this information allows taxpayers to potentially avoid our systemic abilities to identify noncompliance, in essence, wholly jeopardizing voluntary compliance. It could even allow information that would evade detection. The IRS is not releasing the document, as the release of this document represents a significant risk to the agency. I want to include this into the record.
So the risk to the agency, did they define what that risk was, or what the consequences of any damage would be to the agency?
They did not, to my knowledge, inform us of precisely what that was.
Well, in that case, I'm going to go back. I think I had 2 minutes and 18 seconds left. I want to go back and say this is exactly why we need to be.
You want to reclaim your time?
Reclaim my time,
please.
So, this is exactly why we should be looking into this. They said it would create a risk to the agency, yet they haven't defined what that risk is. We need to know about that. So again, this seems pretty basic to me. Let's go. Let's find out exactly what's happened so we can understand this risk.
Thank you, Dr. Ferguson. If the measure fails, my suggestion would be that the staff directors on both sides simply have the IRS in for a private conversation, and then inform members or members should be able to participate if they would like.
Yes, and I think members should participate in that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there other members who would like to strike the last word? I believe the gentlelady from West Virginia, Ms. Miller, would like to move to strike the last word.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Neal and Ranking Member Brady. You know, this year the IRS had 10.6 million unprocessed business and individual returns and 3.2 million unprocessed amended returns. I even had a lady approach me in a water aerobics class last week, upset that she had yet to receive her return from the IRS, and we'd already done an inquiry about it. I'm very concerned with the IRS's decision to destroy 30 million American taxpayer records. This also raises concerns with the IRS's future abilities to effectively process even more paperwork, such as the 1099-K forms, which will be used for Democrats' expanded reporting requirements on working class Americans. In order to pay for their reckless spending package last year, congressional Democrats used a budget gimmick to lower the reporting requirement of gig economy workers and small businesses from $20,000 and 200 separate transactions to simply $600 of income. This will lead to taxpayers receiving a form they've never seen before for taxes that most of them don't even owe, leading to overpayments and the IRS receiving an even higher volume of 1099-K forms. As the IRS obviously struggles with its already overburdened workload, now is not the time to add more fuel to the fire. I introduced H.R. 3452, called the Saving Gig Economy Taxpayer Act, to fix this mistake. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank the gentlelady. Are there other members who wish to move to strike the last word? The gentleman from New Jersey, as well, is recognized to strike the last
Mr.
word.
Chairman, I find that there's some merit in this resolution, believe it or not.
Thanks for that.
I'm not finished. Need I
The chair would note this is the first time that the gentleman has been.
Need I share with you the fact of who is the boss at the IRS? You know, we've had hearings about this, and I would think that some potent questions here, that IRS has to come before us and answer some of your questions. I cannot vote for the resolution because of how it's presented. But I'll tell you one thing. We needed personnel. We want to go back to over the history, Mr. Chairman. We needed personnel. But I find it very difficult to put that kind of money into the hands of an individual who has not proved himself at all. But remember how he got there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Are there other members who would like to strike the last word? If there are not to be any amendments, the chair would recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report HRES 1283 adversely to the House of Representatives.
The gentleman has moved that we adversely report HR 1283 to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Rice requests recorded vote.
I'd like to
Is that
request
true, Mr. Rice?
I'd like to request a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Rice requests a recorded vote. The clerk will please call the roll.
Mr. Doggett. Aye. Mr. Doggett votes aye. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer votes aye. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind votes aye. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell votes aye. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis votes aye. Ms. Sanchez.
Aye. Aye.
Ms. Sanchez votes aye. Mr. Higgins. Mr. Higgins votes aye. Ms. Sewell. Ms. Sewell votes aye. Ms. Delbene.
Aye.
Ms. Delbene votes aye. Ms. Chu.
Aye.
Ms. Chu votes aye. Ms. Moore.
Aye.
Ms. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kildee. Mr. Kildee votes aye. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle votes aye. Mr. Byer. Mr. Evans?
Aye.
Mr. Evans votes aye. Mr. Schneider?
Aye.
Mr. Schneider votes aye. Mr. Swazi?
Aye.
Mr. Swazi votes aye. Mr. Panetta? Mr. Panetta votes aye. Ms. Murphy?
Aye.
Ms. Murphy? Ms. Murphy votes aye. Mr. Gomez?
Gomez, aye.
Mr. Gomez votes aye. Mr. Horsford? Mr. Horsford votes aye. Ms. Plaskett? Ms. Plaskett votes aye. Mr. Brady?
No.
Mr. Brady votes no. Mr. Buchanan?
No.
Mr. Buchanan votes no. Mr. Smith of Nebraska?
No.
Mr. Smith of Nebraska votes no. Mr. Kelly?
No.
Mr. Kelly votes no. Mr. Smith of Missouri?
No.
Mr. Smith of Missouri votes no. Mr. Rice? Mr. Rice votes no. Mr. Schweikert? Mr. Schweikert votes no. Mr. LaHood? Dr. Wenstrup? Dr. Wenstrup votes no. Mr. Arrington? Mr. Arrington votes no. Dr. Ferguson? Dr. Ferguson votes no. Mr. Estes? Mr. Estes votes no. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Hearn? Mr. Hearn votes no. Mrs. Miller?
No.
Mrs. Miller votes no. Dr. Murphy? Dr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Kustoff? Mr. Kustoff votes no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson votes aye. Mr. Byer? Mr. LaHood?
Mr. LaHood votes no.
Chairman?
Mr. LaHood?
Mr. LaHood?
No.
Mr. LaHood votes no. Mr. Chair?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
The clerk will report the roll.
Mr. Chairman, I have 24 ayes, 17 noes.
There being 24 ayes and 17 noes, the motion is agreed to. HR Resolution 1283 is ordered reported adversely to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff members are authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill, and members have 2 additional days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, dissenting, or minority views. Our next order of business is House Resolution 1288. This resolution would require the Department of Labor to provide all documents in their possession relating to unemployment insurance fraud perpetuated by the foreign criminals after the enactment of the emergency unemployment programs in March of 2020. We should all be proud of the work that we did to provide desperately needed unemployment benefits to workers during the pandemic. Our economy recovered much faster than Europe or other places because of it. Those benefits allowed hardworking Americans to put food on the table, keep a roof over their heads until they indeed could go back to work. And I would remind all that the 22 million jobs that were lost have now all been recovered. They helped to lay the groundwork for the fastest jobs recovery in America's history. Criminals did take advantage of overwhelmed state unemployment offices to file fraudulent unemployment claims, and no one should be able to get away with that. That's why Ways and Means Democrats provided the Biden administration with $2 billion to address unemployment fraud and equity issues revealed by the pandemic. We should note the U.S. Attorney's offices are quite busy. The administration has used these dollars well, and they've worked with the Inspector General and Department of Justice to prosecute criminals and have recovered hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent payments. But this resolution would do nothing to fight fraud. It's likely that the documents it seeks are the Department of Justice, the Inspector General's office reports, and are currently a part of criminal investigations and prosecutions. I think we don't want to jeopardize. This resolution does nothing to help everyday Americans put food on the table, pay their bills, or take care of their families. Democratic committee members are focused on legislation that will help women, families, seniors, and indeed all Americans. For this reason, I urge our colleagues to report this resolution adversely. Let me recognize Mr. Brady for the purposes of an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield my time to the author of the resolution, Dr. Winstrup.
Dr. Winstrup is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On behalf of Representative Walorski, I'd like to introduce for consideration this resolution of inquiry directing the Secretary of Labor to provide the House of Representatives documents in the Secretary's possession related to unemployment insurance fraud or UI fraud during the COVID-19 pandemic. We have a role here. Specifically, this resolution directs the Secretary to provide documents on unemployment insurance funds flowing to criminal syndicates and fraudsters in foreign countries like China and Russia. I'd like to remind everyone that the President has declared the pandemic is over, and so we should move on from this point. Our Democrat colleagues continue to turn a blind eye to what is possibly the greatest theft of taxpayer dollars in American history. We're facing billions of dollars lost to unchecked unemployment fraud involving organized cybercrime and international crime rings. Yet the Democrats have ignored repeated calls for congressional oversight hearings. This resolution is the first time this committee has given any airtime to discussing the issue, and only now because the majority is compelled to. During previous markup of Build Back Better, I offered an amendment to address unemployment fraud. The chair recognized the problem and assured me that we would address the issue and he would discuss it with the speaker. I'd like to submit a document for the record that summarizes the amendment and the partisan vote tally that took place during that time. Mr. Chairman, I'd also like to submit two letters for the record, one dated March 15, 2021, and the other dated February 22, 2022. These letters call for a Ways and Means oversight hearing to investigate the size, scope, and severity of criminal fraud in pandemic unemployment programs.
Hearing no objection, such will be the order.
Mr. Chairman, neither of these letters received a response. A hearing on unemployment fraud remains long overdue. It's our responsibility to act as good stewards of taxpayer dollars. We have to ensure accountability to American taxpayers that their dollars are not lost to fraudsters and international crime syndicates. I never dreamed that in the United States of America, combating fraud would be a partisan issue where Democrats prefer to accept it all at taxpayers' expense. This isn't a victimless crime. Unchecked fraud turned thousands of Americans into unwittingly identify theft victims. I had one constituent who called my office crying. He was notified that someone took unemployment out of his wife's name. His wife had recently passed away. Reports range from 80 billion to 163 billion in fraudulent unemployment payments. Some outside experts say the number's even higher. Under the Biden administration, the Department of Labor has only exacerbated fraud by allowing the use of blanket waivers that would let states off the hook for due diligence and fact-finding. During our markup of the American Rescue Plan, we introduced these amendments, and to stop this, the Democrats unanimously rejected all these proposals, including an amendment offered by Representative Devin Nunes to verify the identity of applicants for unemployment benefits and get documentation prior to sending any money. Now that the programs have ended, these cases are working their way through the court system. It's become increasingly clear that groups who perpetrated unemployment fraud pose a national security risk. Look, unemployment fraud has left taxpayers on the hook for potentially hundreds of billions, yet only a little over $4 billion has been recovered. Democrats may not be willing to even admit the problem, but Republicans are taking action. In June, we introduced the Chase COVID Unemployment Fraud Act of 2022. The bill would jumpstart efforts to claw back federal funds and pursue recovery of fraudulent payments by ensuring aggressive investigation and prosecution of criminal fraud in pandemic unemployment programs. Enough is enough. It's time for this committee and Congress to go after fraudsters and recover the dollars that have been lost. And that begins by having the Labor Department provide a full accounting of pandemic unemployment fraud. I urge my colleagues to report this resolution favorably, as it's an opportunity to show that you are not okay with fraud. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Are there other members who wish to strike the last word? The gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Chairman Neal. I move to strike the last word.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you to the chairman and ranking member. Good afternoon, and I want to thank my colleague, Dr. Winstrup, for his commentary on this, and of course, Ms. Walorski, who we again extend our condolences to her family and I'm not surprised of her advocacy on such an important issue. I was proud to vote in favor of the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program to help people who traditionally would not have qualified for unemployment insurance because of the type of work that they did. But sitting here listening to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle express concerns about unemployment insurance fraud, I couldn't agree with you more. Now, I don't accept the fact that fraud and identity theft is something that we should just allow to happen. And that is why I agree we should be taking action. That's why I introduced HR 8661, the Guaranteeing Unemployment Assistance and Reducing Deception Act, the GUARD Act. I think that we can all agree that the pandemic revealed many structural inadequacies of our nation's unemployment system that are administered by the states. Criminal organizations seized on the opportunity to steal, finding ways to illegally access people's benefits, sometimes simply by applying as someone they simply knew existed and had a job. That's why my bill enables aggressive action to recover pandemic unemployment benefits that were paid to these criminal cartels. It supports prosecution of ringleaders and helps fraud victims. My bill also protects against the future use of weaknesses discovered during the pandemic, and it gives the Department of Labor new tools to assist, penalize, and reward states' performance in key areas, such as program integrity and fraud prevention. The GUARD Act, which I've authored, will help states improve their systems and empowers the appropriate agencies to do their job and protect our constituents, to go after and recover from funds from criminal cartels that took advantage of the pandemic crisis. And I'm very thankful to the support of organizations like the National Employment Law Project in support of my legislation. So I am glad to see that we can all agree on the importance of a strong unemployment insurance program, and we shouldn't wait. We should take action on my legislation. So I urge my Republican colleagues to join me in this effort. I invite you to become a co-sponsor of my legislation, and I appreciate the chairman and the committee staff for their work with me on this legislation to protect our constituents, hold criminal cartels accountable, and protect taxpayer resources, particularly during an economic downturn like we experienced during the pandemic. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Are there other members who wish to be recognized to strike the last word? The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Buchanan, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
And I'd like to thank my colleague, Mr. Winstrup, for his introducing this resolution. I can't understand why, when you see the Washington Post reported $163 billion in fraud, you take a look at as high as maybe $400 billion in fraud. We need to be looking at this clearly because we have an oversight responsibility. The other thing, Mr. Chairman, you and I talked about and you were very open to is everybody knows, for as long as I've been on the committee, is in terms of Medicare fraud, which is high as 10%, $60-70 billion a year. I think that's the number that's kind of going out the door one way or the other. But these are types of things that should be bipartisan, that we should be working on and taking a look at to better. This is just clear. You can argue about some programs, but this is just when we got clear fraud, we need to figure out, where we're at together and figure out a way to resolve some of these things going forward. And with that, I yield back.
Sure. I just a comment on that because I think the gentleman's right about Medicare in particular, and I think it might not be a bad idea based on what you've suggested. Perhaps if Mr. Brady and I were to invite the appropriate head of the Justice Department who handles Medicare fraud to come in and address these issues with us. We could do it privately, not to impede an investigation, but to get some general. Yeah.
Parts of Florida.
Yeah.
All these fraudsters.
Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, and Southern California are centers on it. Yeah. Okay. Are there other members who wish to move to strike the last word? The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am greatly concerned with the fact that we have a great resolution here brought by Dr. Winstrup, and it is being dismissed by the majority when we know that there is a huge problem out there. You know, early in the pandemic, we had bipartisan action to try to keep people employed, try to get folks the resources that they needed, and time was of the essence. And we have had a lot of time to now go back and root out the fraud that we are told is rampant. And the fact that someone in need cannot access benefits because someone else stole their identity, that needs attention. The fact that the Washington Post, as was pointed out earlier, has estimated that there's been $163 billion in fraud through the unemployment compensation. We should all be alarmed about that. And we need it. I know that there are prosecutors out there going after the fraudsters, but to go after fraud after it has happened is not as efficient as setting up a process before payments are made to prevent fraud. I mean, I can't even imagine how many prosecutors it might take to go after $163 billion of fraud that has been perpetrated by an untold number of individuals. So that we need to take this more seriously. I wish that the administration would take this more seriously. I think they are taking an entirely different approach. But this time here has actually been described as a waste of time. And I think actually the true waste of time is in the past 2 years is where we have failed to conduct oversight on not just this, but the IRS backlogs, the leaked confidential taxpayer information, and the administration's failure to really take inflation seriously. Those are the things that we need to address much more seriously than we have seen, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Are there other members who wish to strike the last word? And the chair will recognize Mr. Kelly to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to submit for the record a letter sent March 12, 2021 to you, Mr. Chairman. This is Mrs. Walorski had made this initial request. And we have requested several times to have a hearing based on the fraud that was taking place in this issue. And the estimates range from 80 billion to as much as nearly half of all COVID unemployment aid. I'll say it another way, 400 billion is more than the entire 2021 budgets of the Army and Navy combined. I know you have great respect for this committee, and I got to tell you, I know you, and I know how you feel about it. What I can't understand is a committee that is charged with the oversight of these programs in 2 years has ever failed to actually come together to have an oversight meeting on this and to find out what's going on. This is all taxpayer money. And for whatever reason, we've decided, for one reason or another, and I don't know, we just don't pay attention to it. And I can tell you, today's hearing, I was going to save this for tomorrow, but what is it that we're doing? Really? At the very end of this session, we've decided to look into some of these issues? It can't be because we didn't have time, because we've had very few hearings, we've had very few briefings. And I go back to the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We spent almost 2 years having hearings, having briefings, having members be able to come forward, ask questions that they wanted to ask and try to get answers to it before we brought it up for a vote. This committee is so consequential. And I know you have this deep respect for Ways and Means, and I know you feel that way. My question is, where is your party's leadership on this? For whatever reason, we have not been able to do the type of inquiries, the type of hearings that we should be having. So I want to again submit this. Ms. Walorski is, of course, passed, but she had a concern back in March 12th of 2021 and requested some action on this. It's never been addressed. It's never been addressed. Of all things that should not be, in my opinion, should not be politically motivated, but should be policy motivated, this committee, above all other committees, and this is without any disrespect to other committees because they all have an importance, this committee has the greatest committee to the American people. It's one of the oldest committees, if not the oldest committee, and with jurisdiction that covers almost everything that comes down to what's important to our taxpayers. why, at the end of a session, will we decide to hurry up and rush something through to say, well, we did have a hearing on it. Is it any wonder that the American people have lost the faith, trust, and confidence that they need to have in our form of government? I know the people I represent ask me all the time, why don't you do something about it? And I said, I'd love to, but we haven't been at the table. We haven't been in the room. We haven't been in the building. We haven't even been allowed to be in the town. I see votes that take place day after day on that floor. People voting proxy. Oh, somebody's going to proxy for me. So why? Why? In the world I live in, 30 hours a week qualifies for being temporarily employed, not fully employed. The American people place all their faith and trust and confidence in us. And for whatever reason, the political jamming that we see has taken place over the incredible policy that this committee has come up with during the course of our government's existence. I do not criticize you, Mr. Chairman. You know that. I have great affection for you because I know who you are and I know what you feel. I just really do question the majority's commitment to what it is we're trying to get done. When we fail to address this, I can't believe that over the combined budgets of the Army and the Navy, $400 billion in possible fraudulent payments. This is all taxpayer dollars, every single dollar, every single penny. And we couldn't find time to look into what was going on. It's a great disappointment, not only to me, but to all members of this, and especially to you, sir, because I know you would have probably done this sooner had we had the green light to do it. But I am going to submit this for the record.
So ordered.
Thank you.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the next member who wishes to strike the last word, and that would be the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As my colleague from Pennsylvania just noted of the hard work of our former colleague, Ms. Congresswoman Wolarski, I want to publicly thank her for putting forth this effort in pushing this resolution and trying to address all of this fraud. And I want to thank you, Dr. Winstrup, as well for carrying on in her memory and making sure that this is taken care of. This is a huge issue, Mr. Chairman. If you look back when President Biden took over, we had more than $1 trillion of excess COVID funds that was still just lingering out there. The response that the Democrat majority had was to pass another spending bill, $2 trillion. $2 trillion, they called it COVID relief, but less than 9% of it actually went towards COVID. It went towards so many other things that we've been highlighting how much waste it was. But we gave opportunities to the majority, and they refused to include common sense proposals that would have strengthened identity verification and fraud prevention measures in the UI program. The majority was in such a rush to spend American tax dollars, trillions of Americans' tax dollars, that their hastily crafted plan left trillions vulnerable to foreign crime rings. Foreign crime rings. The so-called rescue plan became law over 17 months ago, and still not a week goes by that there isn't a new headline about stolen identities harming unemployment recipients, crime rings stealing small business relief dollars, and the list goes on. Multiple news outlets have reported that fraud from federal pandemic spending has exceeded hundreds of billions of dollars. But the exact figure is unknown. The exact figure is unknown. And why? Because the Biden administration and the House Democrats refuse to perform any oversight. Any oversight. And that's what this resolution is all about. This resolution is all about just giving us 1 ounce of oversight to see how hundreds of billions of dollars have been used under fraud. I can't believe that that can't be bipartisan. I don't understand why this committee, why our colleagues on the other side of the aisle refuse to join with us to see why hundreds of billions of dollars are being lost in fraud. The Washington Post, which is not the most conservative paper by any means, has said over $160 billion in fraud. Why can't one person on the other side help get this administration to respond? Myself, Ranking Member Jordan, Luke DeMeyer, and Brady. We sent a letter not too long ago to the Department of Justice on this very issue. This very issue. And you know what they sent back to us? Copy of testimony. That was not a response to our letter. Not a response. I hope my colleagues have enough respect for American taxpayers that this committee would actually look into the oversight of hundreds of billions of dollars that's being misappropriated. Do it for Jackie Walorski. She saw it was a problem. I hope that you all will do the right thing. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. The chair would note that the Justice Department minutes ago charged another 47 people with $250 million worth of fraud in the pandemic relief programs. Are there other members who wish to be recognized? The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized to strike the last word. Mr. Smucker.
Like to thank the chairman. And Mr. Chairman, if we could go back to your comments. You talked in your comments, if we may, about the Justice Department, and again, just referred to that about the Justice Department prosecuting folks with unemployment. And you raised a figure, I thought, of several $100 billion recovered. I was wondering whether I misunderstood that or if you had an actual figure.
I was interrupted here. Mr. Smucker,
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I was looking for a clarification. During your initial comments on this resolution, you had referred to the Department of Justice prosecuting, and you raised an amount that had been recovered, and I wanted to clarify the amount.
I believe it's $250 million right now that I believe is on the heels of other hundreds of millions of dollars that are currently within the realm of Justice Department investigations.
$250 million.
250 at the moment. I just thought that it was ironic that as we were talking about this issue, another 47 people have been charged.
I'm saying, I'm sorry, but you had mentioned earlier dollars recovered for this, the unemployment. That's 250 million, or is what was just announced now?
This is fraud, and as Mr. Smith correctly noted, is not exactly the most Republican newspaper in the country. The Washington Post is reporting that.
Yeah, that's on food. I was just trying to understand how much we believe was recovered, and
if I might,
it's minuscule.
Yeah, no, fair enough.
Yeah.
If I might, though, I think that the arguments that have been made here have been about unemployment insurance, but also routinely the reference has been made to the word fraud.
Yeah. Thank you. I guess the point I wanted to make, it's still a very, very small amount compared to the total amount of fraud that the Department of Labor's own watchdog has put out. And then I wanted to react to two other things, Mr. Chairman, that you said in your opening comments. You talked about the benefits of this program for American people who had received the additional unemployment benefits. And I just want to point out that this resolution has nothing to dollars that went to the American people. This resolution is about dollars that went to foreign crime organizations and individuals. It's not even to people who receive benefits that shouldn't have. It's about a massive fraud perpetuated by foreign agencies. So it does have nothing to do. We can have a debate about whether the unemployment program was beneficial, whether it worked, whether it disincentivized work, but that's not what this resolution is about at all. And then the other comment you made was that this resolution does not help to put food on the table. And to some degree, I take issue with that, because I think anytime that we can root out fraud, we can understand what has happened, it's going to help American taxpayers and put more food ultimately on their table. And so I think this is an important resolution. And I am as well flabbergasted that Democrats who may even agree with some of these resolutions that are unwilling to to support them. And I go back to what Mr. Pasquarello said, which I think is indicative of this entire process today. He said he actually agreed. I don't want to put words in his mouth. He believed there was some validity to the concerns that were raised in the IRS, but yet he said he couldn't support it because of the form of the question. So my question is, what form would he be able to support? Is this truly that just because it comes from Republicans, Democrats won't support real questions that we are asking that are important for the American taxpayers? Or is it because we have a Democrat president? Have we gotten to the point where oversight by Congress, a core function of Congress where we're to provide oversight, cannot be done when it's the president of your own party? Mr. Chairman, I know I've gone on, but I don't understand why members of the Democrat Party are not interested or seemingly uninterested in really learning what has happened and what the administration knew about the fraud that was prevalent in this program. Hundreds of billions of dollars in this program. So I'm frustrated with the process here today. Apparently, even when Democrats agree, they aren't willing to work with us to provide the oversight that Congress should be providing on the administration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. There are now 4 votes on the floor, and we have one more resolution to go. So we will return after we recognize Mr. Estes, or as much progress as we can make before that happens. Mr. Estes, I believe, would like to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Early in the COVID pandemic, Congress did some critical work to provide a safety net support for unemployed Americans during the COVID pandemic. But many Kansans in my district suffered from unemployment through no fault of their own, and they suffered to receive the benefits and even talk to a live person at the Kansas Department of Labor. What makes this even worse is that while thousands of Kansans would spend hours, in some cases days, trying to get a hold of somebody at the Kansas Department of Labor, hundreds of millions of dollars in fraudulent claims are being successfully processed. Criminals took advantage of this crisis and hurt hardworking Kansans in the process. Just last week, an audit revealed that the Kansas Department of Labor paid $466 million in fraudulent unemployment claims from March 2020 to March of 2022. And the Kansas State Legislature is continuing to investigate this issue. In September of 2020, when it was most critical for the Kansas Department of Labor to operate at a full capacity to help these unemployed Kansans, they had to shut down due to 45,000 fraudulent claims clogging up the system. Throughout the public health emergency, my office has heard from countless constituents who are struggling to feed their family, pay their rent, or in danger of losing their car. This experience was just of Kansans. Estimates are that there's 80 to 160 billion or more in unemployment benefits that were improperly paid across the country. Our constituents and taxpayers deserve an accurate accounting of the true scope of this problem, and the Department of Labor must release all relevant documents to help us. And that's why I support this resolution. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. Is there anybody else who would like to be recognized? The gentleman from Tennessee. Mr. Kustoff is recognized to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I move to strike the last word.
Is recognized.
Thank you. When we look at this resolution, it's pretty simple. It's not nefarious. It does something that I think we all agree that is noted and is necessary, that there has in fact been fraud, that some of the fraudsters pursuant to the resolution are in foreign countries like China and Russia. So when you read the face of the resolution, it's simple, it's self-explanatory, and it is not nefarious. And with that, I would like to yield the remaining time to my colleague from Ohio, Dr. Winstrup.
I thank the gentleman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to say this resolution is not worthless. We can't continue to ignore wrongdoing. Mr. Chairman, I know you had to step out when I was speaking the first time, and I was addressing some things to you with all due respect. I remember during the markup for Build Back Better, I said, we're going to offer a lot of amendments, and you guys will vote every one of them down. You said, oh, I'm not so sure about that. Well, you did. You voted them all down. During that time, I offered an amendment to address this particular fraud issue. And you were kind enough to say that you recognized the problem, and you assured me that we would address it, and that you would even discuss this with the speaker. Well, this resolution is the first time this committee has given any airtime to discussing the issue. And now, only because the majority has no choice, you're compelled to hear about it. And while you were out, I submitted a document summarizing the amendment that I had offered and the partisan vote that took place that day, voting it down. And we do need to address this. And I had never dreamed that in the United States of America, that combating fraud on the government, would be a partisan issue, where it seems Democrats prefer to accept it and ignore it. And it's all at taxpayers' expense. So we do have a tremendous role here. But also what I would like to say is, and I'm curious, is it under the speaker's direction that we haven't done this? I submitted for the record 2 letters that we sent to address this issue, asking that this issue be addressed, and we got no response. So I don't know if that's coming from the speaker or where, but I do say this right now. Sitting here today, this is an opportunity to show that we are not okay with fraud. Both sides of the aisle to say we are not okay with fraud, and we will address this issue, and this committee will take its role. I know that other agencies are taking some action, but this committee needs to take its role up in this situation. Pass this, support this resolution, and let's move forward as a committee and do some good bipartisan work that I know we can do. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
But there is time left on Dr. Winstrup's time.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I am fine with my time and yield it back to you.
Thank you. I don't think there are any amendments to this request, so with that, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee report HRES 1288 adversely to the House of Representatives.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to record a vote.
So the question is on reporting H.R. 1288 adversely to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and H.R. Resolution 1288 is ordered adversely reported to the House. With that,
Formally, I'd like to request.
Dr. Winstrup is recognized for a roll call vote. Please, the clerk will call the roll, and we intend to move to the next resolution as soon as this is concluded.
Mr. Doggett.
Aye.
Mr. Doggett votes aye. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes aye. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer votes aye. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind votes aye. Mr. Pascrell.